Good evening. Tonight we are going somewhere small, dark, and surprisingly bloody, the human mouth. Specifically, we are going back to a time before anyone had the slightest idea what to do about a bad tooth, which is a kind way of saying centuries of frightened people staring into each other's open jaws, sighing, and reaching for whatever sharp object happened to be nearby. This is the story of dentistry before modern medicine. Before I begin, thank you to everyone who requested this topic in the comments. So many of you write in at odd hours, half dreaming already, and somehow those late-night requests turn into the episodes people come back to again and again. So thank you for handing me your nightmares. If tonight's episode helps you drift off, feel free to leave a like or subscribe, though only if it genuinely helped. There is no pressure here, ever. Tell me in the comments where in the world you're listening from tonight, and what time it is where you are, because somewhere out there it is always 3 in the morning. This show is also available on Spotify now, for anyone who would rather not stare at a glowing screen while falling asleep. The link waits for you in the description below. Dim the lights. Turn on something that hums softly in the background, a fan, a heater, anything steady, and let yourself sink into the mattress. Let's slow down for a moment and simply wonder, have you ever thought about what a toothache actually felt like before painkillers existed at all? Did the idea of flossing even exist, or was that simply unthinkable? Who decided it made sense for the man cutting your hair to also be the man ripping out your molars? Could a single cavity have ended your life in the year 1300? Why do so many old paintings show people smiling with their mouths shut so tightly? And here is the real question. Would you have had the nerve to sit down in front of a crowd at a public fair, while a total stranger with no formal training whatsoever went digging around inside your jaw for the entertainment of everyone watching? Well, stop wondering, because congratulations, you have just woken up with a tooth that is throbbing like a second heartbeat, somewhere in a year long before your own. And in that world, once a tooth decided to turn against you, there was almost nobody coming to help. Good luck to you. Let's begin with the one experience nearly every single person who ever lived has shared. From the emperor down to the field hand, sooner or later, a tooth betrayed them. The toothache might be the single oldest documented complaint in human history, older than written language, older than agriculture, older than the concept of keeping your opinions to yourself. Archaeologists digging through ancient burial grounds regularly find skulls marked with the unmistakable pitted craters left behind by dental abscesses, tiny silent volcanoes carved into bone. There was no aspirin waiting in a cabinet, no emergency dentist a phone call away. There was no phone, no dentist, no appointment system of any kind. There was only you, your aching jaw, and the slowly dawning realization that whatever this was, it was not simply going to fade on its own. And it almost never did fade. This is the part that a modern brain has trouble truly accepting. Today, a toothache is an inconvenience with a fix. You feel a twinge, you book a visit, you grumble about the bill, and within a week or two the whole episode is forgotten. But for nearly the entire length of human existence, that identical twinge was only the opening scene of something with no assured ending at all. It would start small, a flicker of sensitivity when you drank something cold, a dull ache when you chewed on one particular side. You would ignore it because truly, what else was there to do? And then it would settle in for good, working its way deeper, beginning its long, patient siege against your ability to think about anything else. Picture the nights especially, because a toothache has always saved its cruelty for after dark. During daylight hours you had chores, conversation, distraction of every kind. But once you lay down on your straw mattress or your woven mat or the cold stone floor, and the fire dimmed to embers, and the world finally went quiet, that is when the pain rose to fill every bit of the silence. It has its own rhythm, a pulse that matches your own heartbeat exactly, so you lie there feeling your own blood beating in your face, counting each throb, praying for a morning that you already know will bring no actual relief. There was no calling in sick to your own farmstead, no sympathetic manager granting you the day off. So you got up anyway, jaw pounding in time with your steps, and you hauled the water and ground the grain and fed the animals, all while your own face felt like it might slide off your skull at any moment. And everyone around you had lived through some version of the exact same thing. Your mother had suffered it. Your grandfather had suffered it. Even the toughest man in the village, the one who never complained about a broken bone or a bad harvest, had once been reduced to tears by a single back tooth. Shared agony, it turns out, may be the oldest tradition our species actually has. And what is almost humbling is how thoroughly it ignored rank and title. Money bought you a softer bed and richer food, but it bought you no immunity from a screaming nerve. A king could clutch his jaw and groan into silk pillows with exactly the same helpless misery as a beggar slumped by the roadside. A rotten tooth was one of history's great equalizers. It arrived without an invitation, played no favorites, and reminded every single person underneath their crown or their rags that they were, at the end of the day, simply a fragile bundle of bone with something painful going wrong inside it. Try to feel dignified while whimpering over a molar. It cannot be done. So as you drift through tonight's story, warm, safe, and never further than a phone call from relief, take a moment to remember that your species endured this particular horror for thousands upon thousands of years, armed with nothing but stubbornness, superstition, and the fragile hope that if they simply waited long enough, it might somehow resolve itself. It almost never did. Here is a detail that should make you feel wonderfully grateful for the century you happen to live in. For roughly 5,000 years, an enormous portion of humanity was entirely convinced that a tooth rotted because a tiny worm had burrowed inside it and was living there. This was not some fringe belief held by one eccentric healer in one obscure village. This was the accepted, mainstream medical explanation, stretching from ancient Mesopotamia all the way into the 18th century. People pictured a small serpent gnawing quietly at the root, and whatever pain you felt was simply that creature settling in and getting comfortable. It's rather like blamming a flat tire on invisible gremlins, except in this case, virtually everyone on the planet agreed on it, and the standard treatment for it involved smoke. Let's dwell on that word, smoke, for a moment, because the accepted cure once you had accepted the worm theory was to try to lure the creature out into the open. A healer would gather seeds from a plant called henbane, scatter them onto a bed of glowing coals, and instruct the sufferer to lean their aching face directly over the rising fumes, mouth open, breathing the smoke straight in. You would sit there exactly like someone inhaling steam from a simmering pot, except the steam was smoke, and the entire point of the exercise was eviction, not relief. Then the healer would peer inside your open mouth and announce, with total confidence, that the worms were indeed emerging. And sure enough, tiny pale thread-like shapes would appear on the tongue or the gum. Here's the wonderfully strange twist to the whole story. Those little threads were genuinely there. Researchers in the modern era recreated this exact ritual and discovered that heated henbane seeds pop open and release small fibrous strands that look uncannily like tiny worms. So the sufferer saw worms. The healer saw worms. Every single witness in the room saw worms. And the theory was confirmed, again and again, for 5,000 consecutive years, by an accidental magic trick that nobody involved ever realized they were performing. And in its own strange way, it made complete sense at the time. Look at a decayed tooth and what do you see? A hole. A tunnel bored into something that used to be solid. What burrows tunnels into solid material? Worms do. What produces a throbbing pain that seems to shift and pulse on its own? Something alive, surely. Nobody had a microscope. Nobody had ever heard the word bacteria. The worm theory wasn't lazy thinking. It was, honestly, the most sensible conclusion available to someone staring into a hole in their own skull by candlelight. Of course, believing in the worm meant nobody ever addressed the real cause, the sugar, the grit, and the years of neglect quietly eating away at the enamel underneath. It's rather like trying to fix a leaking roof by smoking out an imaginary raccoon, while the actual hole keeps letting the rain pour through. That was 5,000 years of dental treatment in a single sentence. Fumigate the face, declare the worm defeated, and schedule the exact same appointment again next month when the pain inevitably returned. Some cultures pushed the ritual even further. If the smoke failed, healers might attempt to numb the offending creature into stillness, or dig at the tooth directly, or in the more dangerous cases, apply substances to the tooth that were far more hazardous than any imaginary worm could ever be. The worm was blamed endlessly. The worm was hunted relentlessly. And the worm was never once actually caught, because there had never been a worm there to begin with. So the next time your own dentist mentions plaque, or bacteria, or gently reminds you about flossing, take a second to appreciate the sheer luxury of being handed an explanation that happens to be true. For most of human history, the official diagnosis for your suffering was a monster that did not exist, chased away using a trick nobody understood, in a war that could never possibly be won. Let's travel now to ancient Egypt, a civilization of gleaming gold, towering monuments, and genuinely catastrophic bread. The Egyptians accomplished things that still leave modern engineers scratching their heads, and yet their teeth were, almost universally, a disaster. The reason comes down to something as ordinary as breakfast. Egyptian bread was ground using stone querns, and every single loaf that emerged from that process came pre-seasoned with a fine dusting of sand and rock grit. Picture eating a sandwich that had been dragged across a beach 3 times a day, every day, for your entire life. Over years and decades, this relentless grit sanded the enamel clean off people's teeth, exposing the softer material underneath and the nerves that lived there, opening the door wide for infection to walk right in. This wasn't carelessness or poor hygiene. It was simply geography and chemistry conspiring against an entire population. Grinding grain between 2 stones sheds tiny mineral fragments directly into the flour. There was no way around it. And Egypt, being a desert civilization, had airborne sand blowing into everything, settling on dough as it rose, coating the crust as it baked, working its way into every single meal like an invisible glaze designed specifically to destroy teeth. There was no sieve fine enough to filter it all out. If you ate bread and everyone ate bread, every single day you were, quite literally, eating stone along with it. The evidence for this has survived remarkably well, because Egyptian mummies are essentially dental time capsules. When researchers examine those preserved jaws today, they consistently find teeth worn down to flat, smooth nubs, crowns scoured away entirely, the once protected inner pulp left exposed directly to open air. An exposed pulp is nothing less than an open invitation to bacteria. An abscess forms at the root. A pocket of infection begins swelling beneath the jaw, pressing against bone, radiating a pain that no amount of gold jewelry in the world could ever distract from. Pharaohs suffered exactly the same fate as the farmers who toiled in their fields, one of history's small, quiet ironies. You might assume that being worshipped as a living god by an entire kingdom would come with at least a decent smile. It did not. Ramesses the Great, one of the most powerful and celebrated rulers Egypt ever produced, was buried with severe dental disease and abscesses so advanced they would have made his final years genuinely wretched. All the power on earth, and he still likely couldn't chew comfortably on one whole side of his mouth. The afterlife, one imagines, could not arrive soon enough, and neither, frankly, could the anesthesia that wouldn't be invented for another 3,000 years. To their credit, the Egyptians were not oblivious to the problem. They documented tooth pain extensively in their medical papyri, and they developed remedies built from honey, various herbs and minerals, packed carefully around aching teeth. Some of these pastes may genuinely have offered a small measure of relief, or at minimum, the comforting sensation of doing something about an unbearable situation. But no paste in the world could undo a jaw that was slowly, steadily grinding itself into powder with every single meal. So here is a civilization capable of aligning enormous stone monuments to the stars, capable of preserving a human body intact for 3,000 years, capable of organizing labor forces numbering in the thousands, and all the while quietly losing a war against their own dinner. Have you ever bitten into something and felt a horrible, unexpected crunch that had no business being there? For the ancient Egyptians, that wasn't a rare bad batch of flour. That was simply Tuesday, and Wednesday, and every single day of a life that was, in a very real sense, tender from beginning to end. Now let's meet the very first person in recorded history to formally claim the title of dentist, roughly 4,500 years ago. His name was Hesy-Ra, an Egyptian official whose tomb inscription proudly identifies him as something like greatest of those who deal with teeth. We don't know precisely what Hesy-Ra's days actually looked like, and honestly, that might be a mercy. There were no drills, no anesthetic, no formal schools where any of this could be studied. His qualifications, as far as we can tell, amounted to confidence and a steady hand. Still, someone had to go first, and Hesy-Ra stepped into a profession that would spend the next several thousand years mostly delivering bad news to frighten people. The title itself is worth sitting with for a moment. Greatest of those who deal with teeth implies there were others, plural, and that Hesy-Ra stood at the top of some kind of hierarchy among them, which means somewhere in ancient Egypt there existed a small cluster of specialists whose entire professional identity revolved around the human mouth, at a time when most of medicine was still essentially a coin toss between crushed herbs and prayer. There's something almost touching in that. Someone looked at the sheer scale of Egyptian dental suffering and decided, quite reasonably, that it deserved its own department. So what could Hesy-Ra actually offer a suffering patient? Not a great deal, by modern standards, and that's the quietly tragic center of this story. He could likely lance a swollen abscess, releasing built-up pressure, which would have felt like genuine mercy to anyone whose face had swollen tight as a drum. He could pack an aching tooth with a soothing paste of honey and herbs. He could offer calm words, steady presence, and the simple reassurance of a man who had seen countless ruined mouths before and wasn't going to flinch at yours. What he almost certainly could not do was save a badly decayed tooth outright. The tools and the underlying knowledge simply didn't exist yet. Picture the scene. You arrive with your cheek swollen, having gone 3 nights without real sleep, and you sit before this composed, educated official as he leans in close to examine the wreckage of your jaw by whatever light is available. He nods slowly. He mixes something together. He applies it carefully. And crucially, he takes you seriously. After 3 sleepless nights of everyone around you insisting you simply endure it, that alone might be the most genuinely healing part of the entire visit. Sometimes the very first doctor in any field isn't remembered for the treatment he provided, but for finally being the person who agreed that your suffering was real and worth someone's undivided attention. Records show Hesy-Ra also held other prestigious titles. He was a scribe, a trusted royal official, clearly a man of considerable standing and education. This wasn't some fairground performer or a desperate amateur working the margins. This was a respected member of one of history's great civilizations who chose, among all his other duties, to be remembered specifically for his devotion to teeth. In an age when dentistry would later fall into the hands of barbers and traveling street performers, there's something almost dignified about this ancient administrator taking the mouth seriously enough to have it carved permanently into his tomb. Of course, being the first at anything guarantees that everyone who follows will eventually do it better, and Hesy-Ra would likely be both horrified and utterly delighted by a modern dental clinic. But he planted the flag. He stands as the opening entry in a profession that would spend the following several millennia being feared, mocked, desperately needed, and often all 3 at once. Somebody had to be brave enough to look into that very first screaming Egyptian mouth and decide to build a life around it. History remembers his name as Hesy-Ra, and for once, history got the credit exactly right. Long before Rome rose to dominate the ancient world, A civilization called the Etruscans were quietly perfecting something remarkable: false teeth. Around 700 years before the modern calendar even begins counting, Etruscan goldsmiths were crafting delicate bridges from thin bands of gold, using them to hold replacement teeth firmly in place, teeth that were sometimes sourced from animals, and sometimes from other human beings entirely. It was clever, it was durable, and it was, without question, fashionable, because apparently a mouthful of gold has always counted as a flex, no matter the century. The less glamorous truth is that this was a luxury reserved strictly for the wealthy, and the teeth used were not always freely given, which raises uncomfortable questions that nobody at any Etruscan dinner party seemed eager to ask aloud. Let's give the craftsmanship the credit it deserves, because it was genuinely impressive. An Etruscan goldsmith would take thin strips of gold and carefully shape them into a series of small loops or bands, each one sized precisely to wrap snugly around an existing healthy tooth, anchoring the entire device firmly in place. Into the resulting gaps went the replacement teeth, riveted or pinned securely into position. Once finished, the wearer had a functional little bridge spanning the hole in their smile, catching the light warmly every time their mouth opened. Remarkably, some of these devices have survived intact for over 2,000 years, longer, frankly, than plenty of modern dental work manages to last. The replacement teeth themselves are where the story takes its more unsettling turn. Sometimes they were carved from ox or calf bone, shaped and polished to blend convincingly with the wearer's natural teeth. But sometimes, and here you might want to set down whatever snack you're currently holding, the teeth were entirely real, harvested from someone else's mouth. In a world with no concept whatsoever of informed consent, if you had enough gold, a suitable tooth could always be found somewhere. Whose tooth it originally was, and precisely how they came to part with it, are questions the surviving historical record simply does not answer. And that silence is doing a great deal of quiet, uncomfortable work all on its own. For the wealthy Etruscan woman, and existing evidence suggests these devices were frequently worn by women of high social standing. This device functioned as much as jewelry as it did medicine. Displaying gold openly in your mouth announced, unmistakably, that you were rich enough to afford it, and confident enough to show it off freely. It's the distant ancestor of every gold tooth and diamond grill that would follow across the many centuries since. The impulse to transform a dental problem into a visible status symbol appears to be one of the oldest impulses humanity has ever had. What's almost maddening about the Etruscans is how skilled they genuinely were at this, and how completely the knowledge simply evaporated afterward. They had worked out stable, anchored, wearable bridgework at a time when most of the rest of the ancient world was still smoking imaginary worms out of their gums with burning henbane seeds. And then their civilization was slowly absorbed into the rising power of Rome, and much of their careful dental ingenuity disappeared along with it. It would take well over 1,000 years before European dentistry managed to claw its way back to a comparable level of skill. Progress, it turns out, has never actually been a straight line. So the Etruscans leave behind one of history's great false starts, a brief, brilliant glimpse of what genuinely skilled dental craftsmanship could achieve, wrapped in gold and fitted with borrowed teeth, elegant and durable, and available to almost nobody at all. The overwhelming majority of people in the ancient world lived and died with whatever gaps and ruins their diet and their fortune happened to leave behind. But a fortunate, wealthy few got to smile in gold, chewing carefully, hopping nobody at the table asked too many pointed questions about exactly where that lovely front tooth had originally come from. Let's talk now about Roman oral hygiene, and let's take a steadying breath first, because you are not going to enjoy this one. The Romans genuinely cared about having clean, bright teeth, which sounds admirable enough, right up until you learn that their favorite whitening agent and daily mouthwash was human urine. Yes, truly. They swished it. They gargled it thoroughly. And infuriatingly, The ammonia naturally present in it really did brighten the teeth, which is the single most inconvenient detail in this entire story. Imported urine, in fact, was considered a premium product and was taxed accordingly by the state. So the next time you find yourself complaining about the taste of your mint mouthwash, take a moment to remember that there was once an age when the finest gargle available in the entire empire arrived warm and came directly from the source. The underlying science, frustratingly, holds up. Urine contains ammonia, and ammonia genuinely functions as a cleaning and bleaching agent, capable of lifting stains from all sorts of surfaces, including, unfortunately for anyone hopping, this detail was exaggerated teeth. The Romans had no concept of the word ammonia, but they knew from direct experience that this particular substance got things remarkably white. Whether it was their laundered tunics or the smile they intended to flash at a dinner party, they weren't behaving this way out of some strange taste for the disgusting. They were being entirely practical, which somehow makes the whole thing feel worse rather than better. And the detail about imported urine isn't some exaggerated joke added for effect. It's genuinely documented in the historical record. There was a widespread belief that urine sourced from certain regions, Portugal in particular, was notably stronger and more effective than what could be collected locally. So it was gathered, bottled carefully, and shipped across the entire Mediterranean as a premium commodity. Taxes were even levied on this peculiar trade, which led to one of history's most famous one-liners. When a Roman emperor was challenged over the sheer indignity of taxing urine, he reportedly held up a single gold coin and calmly pointed out that it did not smell of anything at all. Money, it seems, has always found a way to launder its own uncomfortable origins. Now picture the actual morning routine. You are a fashionable Roman citizen, eager to make the right impression at the public baths or in the busy forum. You reach for your small vessel of prepared mouthwash. You take a generous mouthful. You swish it thoroughly around your teeth and gums, letting the ammonia get to work brightening everything it touches. Then you spit, and you smile, confident, gleaming, ready for the day. To you, in that particular moment, this is simply grooming. This is the very height of civilized self-care. The fact that it would send a modern person sprinting from the room in horror is entirely a problem for your distant descendants, not for you. To be fair to Roman society, they didn't rely solely on this one unfortunate method. They used chew sticks and rough cloths to physically scrub at their teeth. They created tooth powders from ground-up bone, crushed eggshells, powdered shells, and various abrasive minerals, scrubbed vigorously onto the teeth to polish and clean them. Some of these powders were genuinely quite effective, if perhaps a bit harsh on the enamel over time. Taken as a whole, the Romans were, if anything, notably cleaner and more hygiene-conscious than many of the societies that came both before and after them. They simply carried one very specific, very large blind spot, and it happened to be an unmistakably yellow one. There's a bitter irony buried in all of this too. All that effort spent whitening was constantly being undone anyway by the sweet, honey-drenched foods the Roman elite loved to indulge in. You could gargle all the imported urine the empire had to offer and still be steadily losing the war to a diet built heavily around honeyed cakes and sweetened wine. But at least you would lose that particular war with a bright, ammonia-polished, gleaming smile. And in Roman society, appearances counted for an enormous amount. So tonight, perhaps raise a glass of your completely urine-free, mint-flavored mouthwash and genuinely appreciate it. It is one of the small, quiet miracles of modern life that you have never once had to wonder exactly where your evening gargle came from. Long before bristles, long before plastic handles, long before that little disapproving timer built into your electric toothbrush, there was the humble chew stick. For thousands of years, spanning nearly every culture on the planet, people cleaned their teeth by fraying the soft end of a small twig and rubbing it methodically around the inside of their mouths. The miswak, cut from a particular species of tree, proved so genuinely effective that it remains in active use today, still recommended by some dental professionals even now. It was cheap. It was available virtually everywhere. And it actually worked reasonably well, though of course, it required the discipline of remembering to actually use it, which, judging by the general state of most historical mouths, was apparently a significant ask for a species that also, for thousands of years, sincerely believed worms lived inside their teeth. The genius of the chew stick lies entirely in its simplicity. You take a small twig, ideally from a tree species known to have useful properties, and you chew steadily on one end until the wood fibers soften and gradually split apart into a rough little natural brush. Then you rub that frayed end firmly against your teeth and along your gum line, and the loosened fibers scrub away food debris, while the wood's own natural compounds go quietly to work underneath. Certain trees used for this purpose contain compounds that genuinely fight bacteria and freshen breath at the same time, meaning people were receiving a legitimate antibacterial cleaning without the faintest understanding of why it actually worked. They simply knew from long experience that it did. The miswak specifically, drawn from a tree native to arid regions, became deeply woven into daily religious and cultural life across the Middle East, North Africa, and large parts of Asia, often carrying genuine spiritual significance attached to the simple act of cleaning one's own mouth. It wasn't experienced as a tedious chore so much as a quiet daily ritual, a habit passed carefully down and honored across countless generations. And remarkably, the practice has never really stopped. Walk through certain traditional markets today, and you can still purchase bundles of miswak sticks, used in exactly the same way they were used 1,000 years ago, a living fossil of effective dental care that simply never required any real improvement. Other cultures developed their own independent versions of the same basic idea. People used twigs cut from all sorts of different trees, some naturally flavored, some carrying medicinal properties, some simply whatever happened to be growing conveniently nearby that didn't taste actively unpleasant. Communities across China, across India, and across Africa, and the Americas all arrived independently at essentially the same core insight. A small stick, softened and frayed at one end, makes for a genuinely decent tool for keeping a mouth in reasonable order. When an idea gets invented over and over again by completely unconnected peoples scattered across an entire planet, that's usually a fairly strong sign that the idea genuinely works. The catch, and there's always a catch buried somewhere in this particular story, is that a chew stick only helps the person disciplined enough to actually use it consistently over years of daily habit. It does absolutely nothing to reverse the damage already caused by rough diets or the arrival of sugar into a culture's food supply. It cannot fill an existing cavity. It cannot drain a swollen abscess. It cannot correct a crooked bite. It is prevention, quiet and thoroughly unglamorous. And prevention, historically speaking, has never really been humanity's strongest suit. It has always been far easier to simply ignore a problem until it starts screaming for attention than to spend one mildly boring minute each morning scrubbing a twig against your teeth to stop it from ever screaming in the first place. Still, the chew stick genuinely deserves its moment of recognition and respect. It is arguably the single most successful piece of dental technology ever devised by human beings, measured purely by how long it has remained in continuous, unbroken use, and by how many countless mouths it has quietly served across how many different centuries. The modern toothbrush, with its ergonomic handle and its rows of synthetic bristles and its faintly judgmental built-in timer, is really, at its core, just a chew stick that happened to go to design school. So somewhere between the worm-smoking rituals and the urine-gargling routines, ordinary people going about their daily lives were quietly doing the one thing that genuinely helped. They frayed a small twig, they scrubbed patiently, and then they simply got on with the rest of their day. Simple, cheap, effective. History rarely rewards the sensible, unglamorous option, but the chew stick has quietly outlasted almost everything else in this entire story. Now we arrive at one of history's most alarming job descriptions. For much of the medieval period and well into the early modern era, the very same man who cut your hair was also the man who pulled your aching teeth, drained your blood when you fell ill, and lanced any troublesome boils you happened to develop. This was the barber-surgeon, and that iconic red and white striped pole you still see outside barbershops today carries a far darker origin than most people realize. The red stripe represents blood. Let that particular detail sit with you for just a second. You would walk into the shop expecting nothing more than a simple trim, and while you were already seated, that same barber, using those same unwashed tools, might casually offer to take care of that troublesome molar you'd mentioned in passing. There was no meaningful separation between grooming and outright surgery. It was all bundled together as one deeply unsettling package, and the waiting room atmosphere must have been genuinely unforgettable. The underlying logic behind this bizarre professional arrangement made a certain grim sense at the time, when you think it through. Barbers already owned sharp tools, possessed steady hands from years of careful shaving, and had no particular squeamishness about working closely with the human body. They handled razor blades right up against people's throats and faces every single working day. So when the era's actual physicians, educated men steeped in elaborate theoretical medicine, decided that the messy, hands-on business of actually cutting and pulling things was somehow beneath their professional dignity, that dirty work simply rolled downhill to the man already standing there with a razor in hand. Congratulations, barber, you're now also a surgeon. No additional training required or provided. That striped pole genuinely tells the whole story, once you know how to properly read it. The red represents blood. The white represents the bandages, or alternatively the tourniquet used during the procedure. And the entire design is thought to echo the specific practice of bloodletting, in which a patient would grip a wooden pole tightly to make the veins in their forearm stand out more clearly, while the barber-surgeon opened a vein and let the supposedly bad blood drain steadily into a waiting bowl below. The pole functioned, in effect, as a running advertisement for an entire menu of services, of which a simple haircut was very much the least dramatic option on offer. So picture your actual visit to this establishment. You arrive needing nothing more than a shave. The barber-surgeon lathers your face, scrapes it clean with practiced efficiency, and then, wiping his blade casually on his own apron, glances at your visibly swollen cheek and asks, in the friendly tone of a man upselling additional services, whether you'd perhaps like him to take a look at that troublesome area while you're already seated. You say yes, of course, because who else is there to ask? And so, without changing gloves, because gloves as a concept do not yet exist, and without cleaning his tools in any meaningful way, because germ theory remains centuries away from being discovered, he sets down the razor and picks up whatever instrument he typically uses to yank out teeth. Same chair, same unwashed hands, same single afternoon. The sheer cross-contamination involved is enough to make any modern listener want to lie down immediately. Instruments moved directly from mouth, to open arm vein, to lanced boil, to scalp, with nothing more than a casual wipe on an apron between each individual job, spreading infection from one patient to the next with cheerful, unknowing efficiency. But nobody involved actually understood any of this was happening. The connection between everyday dirt and subsequent disease remained completely invisible to everyone in that room. So the barber-surgeon carried on with his bloody daily rounds with a perfectly clear conscience and a genuinely busy schedule, entirely unaware that roughly half of his well-intentioned treatments were quietly making his patients' underlying conditions considerably worse. To be fair to these men, some barber-surgeons did become genuinely skilled through sheer accumulated repetition. If you personally pull enough teeth and stitch closed enough wounds over the course of a career, you inevitably learn a few real things along the way, and the very best among them developed authentic practical expertise that the theory-obsessed university physicians of the era simply lacked entirely. In time, this humble, blood-soaked trade would eventually give rise to what we now recognize as modern surgery, as the more serious barber surgeons gradually organized themselves, trained more formally, and eventually split off entirely into their own respected medical profession. The lowly blade wielders in the end got the last laugh. But for the ordinary person living through that particular age, the practical takeaway was simpler and considerably darker. When your tooth finally turned against you for good, your available options were genuinely limited. And the leading candidate, more often than not, was the very same cheerful fellow who had just finished shaving the customer sitting in the chair before you. You sat yourself down, gripped the armrests tightly, and simply hoped he happened to be having a particularly good day. Now let's address the part you've likely been quietly dreading since this episode began, the part that makes people wince before they've even heard the full details. Extraction without any form of anesthesia whatsoever. For nearly the entirety of human history, if a tooth absolutely had to come out, it came out while you were wide awake, completely sober, and gripping the arms of whatever chair you were sitting in as though it personally owed you money. There was no numbing agent, no sedative gas, no gentle countdown from 10 while consciousness slipped comfortably away. There was simply a strong pair of hands, a firm and unyielding grip, and a great deal of twisting and pulling until something inside your jaw finally gave way. The sound alone was enough to clear an entire room, which is exactly why so many of these procedures took place out in the open, in public squares, where the screaming was quietly treated as part of the day's entertainment. Let's walk through the actual process slowly, because you genuinely deserve to understand precisely how difficult it truly was. The tooth puller would seat his patient, often clamping their head firmly between his own knees, or having an assistant hold them fast, so that no amount of desperate thrashing could break his grip on the job at hand. Then he would take up his chosen instrument, clamp it securely onto the offending tooth, and begin. Not a single, quick, clean motion, because teeth simply do not come free that way, but a slow, grinding, rocking motion back and forth, gradually loosening the tooth from the surrounding bone, one agonizing increment at a time, while the patient experienced every single fraction of a second of it in full, conscious detail. Describing the actual pain involved is genuinely difficult, and perhaps it's best not to dwell on it for too long. But consider for a moment that a tooth sits anchored directly into living bone, wrapped tightly in a dense network of nerves. Tearing it forcibly free rips through all of that connective tissue at once. There was no mercy built into the method, because there was simply no available alternative to the method. You could not be rendered unconscious. So you simply had to endure it, fully present and fully conscious, while another human being physically dismantled part of your own skull using nothing but a metal tool and the full weight of his body behind it. This is precisely why so many of these extractions took place out in the open, at busy markets and seasonal fairs, in front of gathered crowds. It sounds needlessly cruel on its surface, turning a person's very worst moment into public spectacle, and there certainly was cruelty embedded in it. But there was also a strange internal logic at work. Some healers genuinely believed that a watching crowd helped steady the patient, shamming them gently into holding still and appearing brave in front of their neighbors. And the noise, the truly unforgettable noise generated by the whole grim business, was simply easier to manage out in an open square than trapped inside four close walls. Better, the reasoning went, to let a scream escape freely into a busy marketplace than to have it bounce endlessly off the walls of a small enclosed room. People developed their own desperate personal strategies for getting through the ordeal. Some drank themselves as close to senseless as they possibly could beforehand, though alcohol, unfortunately, does frighteningly little against pain of that particular magnitude. Some bit down hard on a thick strap of leather. Some prayed continuously throughout. Some simply lost consciousness partway through from the sheer shock of it, which was, in its own strange way, the single best possible outcome available, a small merciful window of unconsciousness right in the middle of the entire ordeal. And many people, quite understandably, put off the whole procedure for as long as humanly possible, choosing months of steady, throbbing agony over the sharp, certain horror waiting for them in that chair. That avoidance, of course, carried its own steep cost. A tooth left to rot indefinitely because a person simply couldn't face the extraction might eventually turn into something considerably deadlier than mere pain. So the calculation people faced was genuinely brutal in either direction. Face the screaming, twisting nightmare of extraction right now, or gamble that the underlying infection wouldn't spread further and quietly kill you later instead. Neither option was remotely good. Both were extremely common choices. Have you ever gripped the armrests during a routine dental cleaning, quietly bracing yourself for a discomfort that ultimately never really arrives? Now multiply that anticipation by a factor of 1,000. Remove every single drop of available relief. Add a watching crowd, and a stranger with absolutely no formal training kneeling with his full weight pressed against your chest, and you begin, just barely, to approach the reality of it. For thousands of years, this wasn't even considered the worst-case scenario. This was simply, routinely, what having a tooth removed actually meant. In the 1700s, someone invented a tool that looked remarkably like an oversized door key and functioned, in practice, about as gently as a crowbar. It became known as the dental key, and the underlying idea was straightforward enough. Hook a small metal claw around the base of the offending tooth and rotate the entire device, using pure mechanical leverage to pry the tooth loose from its socket. In theory, this promised to be quick and reasonably efficient. In grim practice, it frequently shattered the tooth outright, tore the surrounding gum tissue badly, and on genuinely memorable occasions, managed to fracture the patient's jaw entirely. And yet it remained in common use for well over a century regardless. Simply because the only real alternative was leaving a rotten, agonizing tooth exactly where it was, and nobody involved had come up with anything meaningfully better. Imagine trusting your own face to a device whose entire design inspiration was clearly a locksmith having an exceptionally bad day. The instrument really did resemble a large key in its basic shape. A long shaft serving as the handle, ending in a metal claw designed to grip the target tooth, alongside a rounded bolster piece meant to rest firmly against the gum and act as a stable pivot point. The operator would carefully fit the claw over the patient's tooth, brace the bolster firmly against the jawbone, and then turn the entire assembly sideways, using that pivot point to lever the tooth up and directly out of its socket. The underlying physics involved is basic and sound, the same essential leverage that allows a small key to turn a stiff, resistant lock. The obvious trouble is that a human tooth is not a lock mechanism, and a human jaw is most certainly not a door. When the device worked as intended, it worked remarkably fast, and speed carried genuine, tangible value in an age with absolutely no pain relief available. A single quick, violent turn, and the offending tooth would be out before the patient had even fully registered what was actually happening to them. But when the procedure went wrong, and it went wrong constantly, by all surviving accounts, the results could be genuinely catastrophic. The rotational force intended to simply lift the tooth free would instead snap the visible crown clean off, leaving the root buried deep in the gum tissue, or it would crush neighboring healthy teeth entirely, or grind away significant chunks of the surrounding jawbone itself. The rounded bolster, pressed hard against soft, delicate gum tissue, tore and mangled virtually everything it made contact with. And then there was the separate matter of exactly what tended to come out of the mouth alongside the intended tooth. Because the key gripped and yanked with such indiscriminate, unfocused force, it wasn't at all unusual for it to bring up the target tooth along with fragments of the teeth immediately beside it, splinters of jawbone, and a generous quantity of torn gum tissue besides. Patients could genuinely walk away with a wound considerably larger and more severe than the single problem tooth that had originally brought them in. You arrived hopping to fix one specific issue and departed with several new ones instead, all of them raw, actively bleeding, and dangerously prone to subsequent infection. The instrument's remarkable staying power, despite all of this documented carnage, tells you something genuinely bleak about the era itself. It wasn't that people failed to notice the widespread damage it caused. It was simply that they had, quite literally, nothing meaningfully better available to them. The dental key was fast to use, cheap to produce, required no particular specialized skill beyond raw nerve and a firm grip, and it did, most of the time, technically succeed in removing the intended tooth. In a world offering no anesthesia and no viable alternative, technically removing the tooth was essentially the entire bar for success. And the dental key cleared that low bar, jaw fractures and all. Over the following decades, various inventors attempted to meaningfully improve the basic design, adjusting the precise angle of the claw, adding cushioning material to the bolster, refining the overall grip mechanism, all in an ongoing effort to make the device destroy slightly less of a patient's face with each individual use. These incremental tweaks helped a little at the margins, but the fundamental design flaw remained permanently baked into the underlying concept itself. You simply cannot gently lever a tooth free from living bone using a device built on the same basic principle as a crowbar, no matter how thoughtfully you pad the handle. The dental key finally faded from common use only once genuinely better forceps designs emerged, and far more mercifully, once real anesthesia finally arrived to make careful, controlled extraction possible for the very first time. But for well over 100 years, this locksmith's nightmare of a tool remained a leading instrument of the trade. You sat down, opened your mouth wide, and placed your entire jaw in the hands of a man wielding what was, in essence, a finely crafted tooth crowbar, and you simply hoped, above all else, that it would only end up taking the one tooth you'd actually come in for. Now picture a bustling market fair, all noise and churned mud and the smell of roasting meat drifting through the air, and at the very center of it, a loud, flamboyantly dressed showman standing confidently atop a small wooden stage. This is the traveling tooth drawer, and he has arrived specifically to relieve your suffering for the collective entertainment of the entire watching village. These men occupied a strange space somewhere between dentist, con artist, and traveling street performer all at once. They dressed in fine, eye-catching clothing, hired musicians specifically to help drown out the screaming, and some even wore necklaces strung together from the teeth of their previous customers. A genuinely grim sort of walking resume. It was theater. It was often terrifying to witness, and for a great many ordinary people, it was quite simply the only dental care they would ever receive across their entire lives. It's worth understanding that these men traveled constantly out of sheer practical necessity. A tooth drawer who lingered too long in any single town would eventually run headfirst into a serious problem. And that problem was the accumulating trail of ruined mouths, fractured jaws, and lingering infections left scattered behind him. Far better, from a purely business perspective, to sweep dramatically into a fair, generate a spectacular profit over the course of just a few days, and be safely 3 towns away long before anyone's swelling turned genuinely dangerous. Constant mobility wasn't simply convenient for these men. It was a core, essential part of the entire business model, a reliable way of always staying one deliberate step ahead of one's own results. The costume and presentation mattered enormously to the whole operation. A genuinely successful tooth drawer dressed like a man of considerable wealth and importance, favoring bright fabrics, elaborately feathered hats, and glinting jewelry wherever possible. Because to a crowd of desperate, suffering people, looking visibly prosperous strongly implied looking competent and skilled. If he could clearly afford such fine clothing, the reasoning went, surely he must be genuinely good at his chosen trade. Never mind, of course, that those fine clothes had actually been purchased entirely with the accumulated coins of previous, less fortunate customers. Presentation itself effectively was the product on offer, with the actual dentistry performed feeling almost like an afterthought bolted onto the end of the real performance. And that necklace of extracted teeth, worn proudly and visibly around the neck, functioned as pure, effective marketing. It served as a portable trophy wall, a boast rendered entirely in enamel. "Look how many teeth I have successfully pulled," it announced silently to every onlooker. "Look how vastly experienced I clearly am." To modern eyes, it reads as something disturbingly close to serial killer aesthetic. But to a genuinely suffering peasant standing in that crowd, it read instead as pure reassurance. This particular man had clearly done this many times before. This man plainly knew exactly what he was doing. The necklace, in its own deeply unsettling way, functioned as a kind of 5-star customer review. For all the theatrical showmanship on display, we shouldn't pretend these traveling performers served absolutely no genuine purpose. For the overwhelming majority of ordinary people, there simply was no other realistic option available. No local dental practitioner within reach. No barber-surgeon conveniently nearby. No spare coin for anything considered more respectable. The traveling tooth drawer, for all his obvious fraud and theatrical flourish, was frequently the only person on the entire earth willing to reach directly into your screaming mouth and finally end the agony that had kept you awake for an entire week straight. He was, without question, a con artist, but he was a con artist who occasionally, genuinely solved your immediate problem, which was considerably more than could be said for the frog you'd spent the previous night pressing hopefully against your swollen cheek. The genuine tragedy embedded in all this is that good outcomes and disastrous ones ultimately came down to little more than sheer luck. There was no reliable way whatsoever for an ordinary customer to distinguish a genuinely skilled drawer from a dangerously careless one in advance. The fine clothes looked identical. The confident patter sounded identical. The trophy necklace looked identical. You climbed up onto that public stage entirely at the mercy of pure chance. Quietly hopping, this particular loud man in the elaborately feathered hat actually knew what he was doing, and that your tooth would ultimately come out cleanly rather than in several painful pieces. So the next time you find yourself sitting quietly in a clean, well-lit waiting room, idly flipping through a magazine, spare a passing thought for your own ancestors, who received their own dental care instead while standing on a muddy wooden platform in front of a jeering crowd, from a complete stranger wearing his previous patients proudly around his neck. It wasn't a clinic in any meaningful sense. It was a show, and you happened to be tonight's thoroughly reluctant star. Let's linger at that same fair just a little longer, because the full spectacle genuinely deserves it. The tooth drawer would spot a visibly suffering soul somewhere in the gathered crowd, coax them gently up onto his platform, and then make an enormous theatrical production out of the entire ordeal that followed. Drummers would drum loudly. Trumpeters would blare their instruments at full volume. Assistants worked the crowd with precise, practiced timing, ensuring that nobody in attendance could clearly hear the awful, wet crunch of the actual extraction taking place. The dazed, bleeding victim would eventually stagger off the platform, and the assembled crowd would break into enthusiastic applause, as though they had just witnessed an impressive magic trick performed live. In a very real sense, they genuinely had, because the actual trick being performed was convincing an entire crowd that this whole spectacle somehow qualified as legitimate medicine. The music itself was never mere decoration. It was calculated strategy, and a genuinely clever one at that. The single greatest ongoing threat to any tooth drawer's business was the unavoidable noise generated by his own work. Nothing empties out a crowd of hopeful potential customers faster than hearing the person immediately ahead of them in line screaming, as though their very soul were being dragged bodily into the underworld. So the hired drummers and trumpeters were positioned carefully to strike up a genuinely deafening racket at the precise moment of each extraction, swallowing the resulting scream whole. The watching audience heard only triumphant fanfare. The patient's private agony vanished entirely into a solid wall of brass and percussion. The deliberate distraction extended well beyond simple sound as well. The most skilled tooth drawers were true masters of misdirection, maintaining a constant stream of jokes, boasts, and grand theatrical promises, drawing every watching eye firmly toward their own face and their own words while the actual physical business took place lower down, largely unseen. An assistant might juggle colorful objects nearby, or a trained monkey might perform some small trick, or the drawer himself might launch abruptly into an elaborate speech about the miraculous healing powders he also happened to have available for sale that same afternoon. Anything at all to keep the assembled crowd from focusing too closely on the actual mechanics of what was being done to the unfortunate soul currently in the chair. And then came the grand reveal, genuinely the money shot of the entire performance. The drawer would triumphantly whip the freshly extracted tooth high into the air, holding it aloft for all to see, and the crowd would gasp appreciatively and cheer wildly. Look, the monster has been defeated. The pain is finally over. The magic has worked as promised. It mattered very little that the actual patient was visibly pale, swaying unsteadily and quietly spitting blood onto the ground. The tooth was held up high. The trick had been successfully completed, and the enthusiastic applause washed comfortably over everything else, including the inconvenient fact that a second tooth and a fair chunk of surrounding gum tissue may well have come out right alongside the intended target. There was often a well-planned second act too, the deliberate upsell, because a captive, delighted crowd is invariably a crowd primed and ready to buy something. Having just demonstrated his apparently miraculous power over pain itself, the drawer would produce his carefully prepared tinctures, his special tooth powders, his various cure-all remedies, and sell them briskly to an audience now thoroughly convinced of his obvious genius. The extraction itself was, in many ways, simply the opening spectacle, the free sample designed to draw people in close. The genuine profit lay waiting in the little bottles of colored water he sold on the considerable strength of the preceding show. It's admittedly easy, looking back from a comfortable modern distance, to see only cruelty in all of this. A person's very worst moment, transformed deliberately into cheap public entertainment, and there was certainly real cruelty woven throughout it. But there was also something almost mercifully communal buried in the whole arrangement. Everyone gathered in that crowd had bad teeth themselves, or fully expected to develop them eventually. Watching someone else survive the ordeal, applauded and still standing upright at the end of it, offered a strange kind of shared reassurance. It could be survived. You could climb up there yourself one day, endure whatever came, and walk away afterward. Terrible comfort, certainly, but genuine comfort nonetheless. Still, strip away all the feathers and the triumphant fanfare, and what actually remained underneath was simply a frightened person in genuinely unbearable pain, hoisted up onto a public stage, held down firmly, and torn open for the collective amusement of an ordinary Tuesday market crowd. The drums covered the screaming, the trumpets covered the crunch, and the enthusiastic applause covered up the simple, grim underlying fact that this performance represented the finest dental care a great many ordinary human beings would ever be offered in their entire lives. So suppose a tooth had developed a cavity, but was still considered worth trying to save. What exactly went into that hole? The honest answer across most of recorded history is a genuinely horrifying grab bag of whatever happened to be lying around at the time. The wealthy might receive carefully packed gold leaf, which was, by the standards of the era, a genuinely decent option. Everyone else might receive molten lead, tin, crushed stone, hardened tree resin, or plain beeswax jammed into the hole and left to simply hope for the best. Some of these fillings slowly poisoned the patient over time. Some fell out again within a matter of days, and some sealed the underlying infection neatly inside, where it could quietly continue festering unseen. This wasn't really repair work so much as it was a wager, with your entire jaw placed firmly on the table as the stake. Gold, to its considerable credit, earned its reputation as the aristocrat of dental fillings, and for genuinely good reason. It doesn't corrode over time. It doesn't react badly with surrounding living tissue, and a sufficiently skilled hand could pack thin sheets of gold leaf carefully into a cleaned cavity, layer upon layer, until it formed a stable plug capable of lasting for years. If you had the considerable money required for gold and access to someone competent enough to place it correctly, you genuinely stood a reasonable chance of keeping that particular tooth for a long while afterward. This was, needless to say, an experience available only to a vanishingly small slice of the overall population. Most people's mouths, across most of history, never encountered a single flake of it. Everyone else made do with whatever local custom and local budget happened to allow, and this is precisely where things start to get genuinely alarming. Molten lead, poured or firmly pressed directly into a cavity, was used with absolutely no awareness that lead accumulates steadily in the human body as a slow, cumulative poison. So the very filling meant to save your aching tooth was simultaneously contributing, quietly and invisibly, to a broader decline in your overall health, one toxic mouthful at a time. You fixed the immediate hole and received a lifelong dose of low-grade poisoning as an unadvertised bonus. Nobody made the connection at the time, because who, after all, would ever suspect the helpful, shiny metal sitting comfortably in their own tooth? The cheaper alternative materials had their own separate comedy of errors built in. Beeswax and various tree resins were simply too soft, so they crumbled apart or washed away entirely within days, meaning any relief they provided was fleeting at best, and the original hole soon returned, hungrier than before. Crushed stone and assorted pastes offered a temporary physical block, but sealed poorly, leaving small gaps through which food particles and bacteria could steadily creep back inside. And here lies the single deepest danger built into this entire practice. A filling placed carelessly over an already infected tooth did not actually stop that infection from progressing. It trapped it instead, sealing the underlying rot inside a neat, tidy little container where it could quietly build pressure and spread unseen in the dark, gradually transforming a merely painful tooth into a genuinely life-threatening abscess. That was the cruel underlying paradox sitting at the heart of historical dental fillings. The entire point was to save the tooth and stop the ongoing suffering, but when done incorrectly, which was, unfortunately, most of the time, the fix actually accelerated the eventual disaster. The patient walked away genuinely believing the problem had been solved, the pain temporarily dulled by the simple act of plugging the hole, while beneath the surface, the infection continued its work entirely undisturbed and completely unwatched. By the time it finally announced itself again in full force, it was frequently far worse than the original cavity that had started the whole chain of events. And yet, you can understand the underlying impulse completely, without any real difficulty. A tooth with an open hole in it hurts constantly. Every single sip of cold water, every small scrap of food, delivers a fresh, unwelcome jolt of pain. Packing something, anything at all, into that hole brings genuinely immediate relief. And immediate relief becomes wonderfully intoxicating once you've already endured weeks of steady, grinding pain. The long-term consequences remained entirely invisible and abstract in that moment. The short-term comfort, by contrast, was real, tangible, and available right now. People chose the immediate comfort over and over again for exactly the reasons you'd expect. So the entire history of the dental filling really amounts to a history of hope steadily outrunning available knowledge. People desperately wanted to save their own teeth, and they packed those aching holes with gold, with lead, with wax, and with quiet prayer, gambling their entire jaws on materials ranging from genuinely helpful all the way to actively poisonous. Sometimes it worked out reasonably well. Often it did not. But the hole was filled, and for a little while at least, the pain fell quiet. And that alone was enough to keep this entire hopeful, hazardous practice running steadily for centuries on end. Here's one that sounds like it belongs in a horror film, but is grimly, thoroughly documented as real historical fact. In the early 1800s, If a wealthy person wanted a genuinely nice set of false teeth, the single finest available material was not ivory, and it was not porcelain. It was actual human teeth, and the freshest, most abundant supply came directly from dead soldiers. Following the enormous, devastating battle at Waterloo in 1815, scavengers moved methodically across the battlefield, pulling teeth from thousands upon thousands of fallen young men whose teeth happened to be healthy specifically because they had died so young. These extracted teeth were cleaned, carefully mounted, and sold to wealthy customers who wore them proudly for years afterward, chewing their evening meals with smiles borrowed directly from the war dead. They became known, quite simply, as Waterloo teeth, and people paid a genuine premium for them, chewing their dinners each night with the borrowed smiles of soldiers who never made it home. The grim underlying logic behind that premium price is worth understanding fully. The wealthy customers who typically needed dentures were, by and large, considerably older, having already lost their own teeth over decades to sugar and slow decay. The teeth available from executed criminals, or from the desperately poor who occasionally sold their own, were frequently diseased and rotten themselves, hardly representing any real upgrade at all. But a recent battlefield represented a source of tens of thousands of teeth belonging specifically to fit, healthy young men, cut down suddenly in the very prime of life, their mouths still full of strong, clean, barely worn enamel. From a purely material standpoint, it was, quite simply, the finest raw supply imaginable at the time. And so, in the immediate aftermath of the battle, moving alongside the burial parties and the looters busy stripping the dead of their boots, buttons, and loose coins, came the dedicated tooth scavengers. They moved steadily among the fallen with small pliers in hand, working quickly and efficiently, harvesting front teeth in particular, since those were the ones that would actually show clearly in a finished denture. Thousands upon thousands of individual teeth were pulled from the dead at Waterloo and packed carefully off to be sorted, cleaned, and eventually sold. The overall scale of this operation was such that the phrase Waterloo teeth stuck permanently to human-sourced dentures for years afterward, regardless of where the actual teeth used had genuinely originated. Once collected, the harvested teeth were boiled thoroughly, carefully sorted by size and general shape, and then mounted onto bases carved from ivory or bone, held firmly together with tiny metal rivets and springs. The finished result, to be entirely fair, could look genuinely quite convincing. A natural-looking set of real human teeth arranged into a natural human smile. The wealthy buyer received a functional, presentable mouth in return, and the small fact that those particular teeth had, just weeks earlier, belonged to a young man dying alone in the mud of Belgium was simply never discussed at the dinner table. At most, it registered as a slightly morbid piece of conversation. There's a strange, almost poetic sense of leveling built into this whole grim business that's genuinely hard to shake once you notice it. Consider the full journey of a single tooth. It grew originally in the mouth of a poor young man, strong and healthy thanks to a modest, simple life, who then marched off willingly to war and died on a foreign battlefield far from home. That same tooth was pulled from his corpse shortly afterward, cleaned, sold, and eventually fitted carefully into the wealthy jaw of exactly the kind of person whose own comfortable, sugar-rich life had slowly rotted their original teeth away. The poor died young with genuinely good teeth. The rich lived on for decades with genuinely bad ones. And in death, the poor man's healthy smile ended up quietly serving the rich man's evening dinner instead. This particular practice didn't end with Waterloo either. Subsequent battlefields across the following decades continued reliably supplying this same grim trade, and the harvesting of teeth from the recently dead persisted, wherever war happened to produce fresh young bodies in sufficient numbers. It only genuinely faded once manufactured porcelain teeth improved enough in quality to offer a reliable supply that no longer required an actual battlefield to replenish. So the next time you happen to see an old portrait of some fine, dignified gentleman from that particular era, smiling faintly and composedly for the painter, consider carefully what might actually be sitting quietly behind those closed, composed lips. A steady private income, a genuinely comfortable life, and quite possibly a mouthful of young men who never came home from the war. Before human teeth, and often right alongside them, false teeth were also frequently carved from ivory, sourced from elephants, hippopotamuses, or walruses. They looked genuinely impressive at first, gleaming, expensive, polished to a fine shine, which was rather the entire point of the exercise. The trouble was that ivory is naturally porous, meaning it steadily absorbed everything it encountered inside the mouth, and it slowly rotted from the inside out, gradually turning brown and producing a distinctive smell capable of clearing an entire dining room in short order. Wearers frequently removed their teeth entirely before eating, because the dentures themselves were considerably more decorative than genuinely functional, popping them back into place only for the sake of polite conversation afterward. You did not wear ivory teeth in order to actually chew your food. You wore them so that nobody watching could easily tell exactly how few of your own real teeth you actually had left. The initial appeal of ivory was obvious enough at the precise moment of purchase. Freshly carved, a set of ivory teeth appeared smooth, pale, and genuinely lustrous, and a sufficiently skilled craftsman could shape them into something resembling a fairly natural-looking smile. For the wealthy customer standing proudly before a mirror in the shop, it felt, in that moment, like a genuine triumph, a fully restored mouth, a second chance at looking whole again. The coming catastrophe wasn't visible yet at all, because it only fully developed after several weeks of actual daily wear, by which point the money had already changed hands, and the buyer was left entirely on their own to deal with the consequences. The fatal flaw was baked directly into the underlying material itself. Ivory isn't solid and fully sealed the way natural tooth enamel is. It's riddled instead with countless microscopic pores, and those pores steadily absorb everything they come into contact with. Placed directly into the warm, moist, food-filled environment of a human mouth, ivory began absorbing saliva, trapped food particles, and bacteria almost immediately. Within just a few weeks, it discolored noticeably, fading gradually from a noble bright white toward a grim yellowish brown. And as the trapped organic material inside it slowly began to decay, it produced a genuinely deep, rotten, entirely unignorable stench, emanating directly from the wearer's own mouth with every single word they spoke. This created a genuine social nightmare that was, in some ways, arguably worse than simply having no teeth at all. Imagine investing a small personal fortune into a beautiful new smile, only to become quietly known, within a single month, as the person whose breath alone could clear an entire room mid-conversation. The very object specifically purchased to restore your personal dignity was now actively demolishing it instead, with every word you happened to speak, and there was no genuine fix available. The rot was baked permanently into the material itself, and short of purchasing an entirely new set outright, the wearer simply lived on inside their own personal, portable fog of ongoing decay, which is precisely why so many people of the era genuinely didn't eat with their false teeth in at all. This sounds absurd on its face, but it was, in fact, standard and widely accepted practice. The dentures themselves were fragile, frequently ill-fitting, and often held loosely in place by little more than basic suction and small metal springs, so biting down on actual solid food risked either snapping the entire apparatus or sending it flying unexpectedly across the room. The dentures existed primarily for show, worn carefully during conversation and formal social occasions, specifically to fill out the face and conceal obvious gaps, and then discreetly removed before the actual meal began, allowing the wearer to eat privately with bare gums in some side room, unobserved by polite company. So the outward reality of high society was frequently the exact opposite of the polished image it worked so hard to project. The elegant, composed dinner guest flashing a lovely smile might well be speaking to you through a set of slowly rotting animal tusks, only to quietly slip away before the meal itself began, eating their soup alone with bare gums in some private side room. The teeth functioned as a mask worn specifically for the watching audience, and removed again entirely backstage. Function had been sacrificed almost completely for the sake of pure appearance, which tells you a great deal about where this particular age placed its genuine priorities. Ivory dentures persisted in common use for a remarkably long time, simply because the available alternatives were either worse or entirely unavailable, and because the wealthy would consistently pay handsomely for the mere appearance of health, even when the actual underlying substance of it was quietly rotting away inside their own heads. It was expensive. It was genuinely smelly. It was barely functional in any practical sense. And for a very long stretch of history, it represented the very best that money could actually buy, a gleaming smile you couldn't comfortably eat with, one that steadily rotted inside your own mouth, and one that quietly announced its own ongoing decay to absolutely everyone standing within arm's reach. Everyone thinks they know that George Washington had wooden teeth. Almost everyone happens to be wrong. This stands as one of history's most stubborn, persistent myths, and the actual truth underneath it is considerably stranger and considerably sadder. Washington suffered from severe dental problems for the entirety of his adult life, and he eventually lost nearly all of his natural teeth as a result. His well-documented dentures were constructed from a genuinely grim assortment of materials: ivory, gold wire, lead, and real human teeth, some of which were purchased from enslaved people held on his own plantation. There was no wood involved at any point. The persistent wooden teeth myth most likely originated from the way aging ivory naturally stained and darkened over time. So the celebrated father of a young nation smiled through public life with a mouth full of other people's teeth, held awkwardly together with metal springs. Washington's ongoing dental misery is remarkably well documented today, largely because he personally wrote about it extensively, complained about it repeatedly, and consulted an entire parade of different dentists about it throughout the majority of his adult life. He began losing individual teeth as early as his 20s, and the steady decline simply never stopped from that point onward. By the time he assumed the presidency, he reportedly had only a single natural tooth remaining, which he clung to desperately for years afterward, since it served as a crucial anchor point for his various sets of dentures. Every single formal portrait you've ever seen of that famously stern, tight-lipped expression, that isn't purely a matter of dignified composure. That is, in significant part, a man actively working to manage a mouthful of poorly fitting hardware. The dentures themselves stood as genuine marvels of grim 18th century engineering. Multiple different sets existed across the years, constructed from carved hippopotamus ivory forming the base, set with human teeth, and occasionally teeth sourced from horses or donkeys, all held firmly together and anchored using gold wire and metal springs. Some particular designs used those metal springs specifically to force the upper and lower plates apart, pressing them firmly against the gums to hold everything securely in place, which meant Washington had to actively clench his jaw shut continuously against the spring's natural tension, just to keep his own mouth from popping open unexpectedly. The sheer physical effort required simply to keep his teeth properly in place must have been genuinely exhausting over the course of an average day. And then there is the darkest thread running through this entire story: the human teeth themselves. Historical records clearly show that Washington purchased teeth directly from enslaved people living on his plantation, paying them only a small fraction of what such teeth were actually worth on the open commercial market. Whether those specific teeth ended up directly inside his own dentures remains genuinely debated among historians, but the underlying transaction itself is thoroughly documented, and it sits uncomfortably at the very heart of this founding father's famous public smile. The dignified image of the nation's first president rested, quite possibly, at least in part, on the bodies of people he personally held in bondage. It is not a comfortable fact to sit with, but it is nonetheless a true one, and it deserves to be told honestly alongside the more comfortable myth it ultimately replaces. So where then did the persistent wooden teeth story actually originate? The most likely explanation is simple, ordinary discoloration. Ivory, as we've already learned, stains steadily over time, and Washington's dentures reportedly developed dark hairline cracks along with a distinct brownish tint as they aged and steadily absorbed wine and food over years of daily use. To a casual observer glancing quickly, that grained, cracked, brownish surface could genuinely resemble wood at first glance. Combine that visual impression with a public eager to embrace a humble, homespun, relatable image of their new national leader, and the wooden teeth story essentially wrote itself, refusing to die out even after more than 2 full centuries. The myth endures precisely because it feels comforting and simple, a folksy little detail that makes a towering historical figure seem more relatable, a bit more down to earth. Oh, he simply had wooden teeth. How quaint, how wonderfully frontier. The actual truth, by contrast, is considerably heavier. Chronic lifelong pain, a mouth full of dead men's teeth held together by constant clenching springs, and a public smile built partly on the bodies of people he enslaved. So the next time someone repeats that familiar wooden teeth line with a knowing smile, you might gently correct them. The teeth were ivory, gold, lead, and human. And the real story behind the most famous mouth in all of American history isn't a charming curiosity at all. It is, instead, a small, dark window into both the man himself and the age that shaped him. In the 1700s, a bold new idea began circulating among the fashionable and the genuinely desperate alike. Why not simply transplant a fresh, living tooth directly from a healthy living donor straight into your own empty socket? Wealthy patients would pay a poor young person outright to have a perfectly healthy tooth extracted. And a surgeon would then immediately jam that same tooth directly into the wealthy patient's freshly emptied socket. It almost never actually worked. The transplanted teeth rarely took root successfully, and considerably worse, this cheerful little practice frequently transmitted diseases directly from one person's bloodstream straight into another's. It stands today as one of the earliest and most starkly literal examples of the wealthy quite literally purchasing the bodies of the poor, one tooth at a time. The underlying theory sounded almost reasonable on its surface, which is precisely what makes the whole practice so genuinely unsettling in retrospect. A living tooth pulled from a healthy young mouth was surely superior to a dead one carved laboriously from ivory or pulled directly from a corpse. If you could simply move it, fresh and still living, from the donor's jaw straight into the recipient's, perhaps it would settle comfortably in, take root properly, and grow as though it had always belonged there. It represented, in its own way, an early dream of genuine transplant medicine, centuries before anyone actually understood the underlying biology that would ultimately render the whole idea impossible. The actual procedure was as brutal as it was mercifully quick, and its success depended entirely on raw speed. A poor young person, frequently a child, would be brought in, and a perfectly healthy tooth would be extracted with all the usual unanesthetized horror described earlier in tonight's story. Then, immediately, before the extracted tooth had any chance to die, the surgeon would push it directly into the freshly emptied socket of the wealthy patient waiting nearby in an adjacent chair. 2 people, seated in 2 separate chairs, one selling off a piece of their own body out of sheer desperation, the other buying it out of pure vanity, briefly connected by a single bloody tooth passing directly between them. It didn't work, and the underlying reasons it failed were completely invisible to everyone attempting the procedure at the time. A transplanted tooth has no genuine way to reconnect its severed blood supply or its nerve endings inside an unfamiliar jaw. The recipient's body simply recognizes it as a foreign intruder. At best, It might cling on loosely for a short while before eventually loosening and falling back out entirely. At worst, it triggered immediate infection and outright rejection. The wealthy recipient had paid a genuine fortune and endured real physical pain for a tooth that was, in effect, already dead the very moment it left its original donor's mouth. But the failure to properly take root wasn't even the worst part of this grim exchange. The far graver danger was invisible and frequently lethal disease transmission. Pushing a raw, freshly bleeding tooth directly from one person's open wound into another person's freshly opened wound represents a near-perfect method for transmitting infection directly from one body to another. Whatever the donor happened to be carrying silently in their own blood could pass directly into the recipient's body in the process. In an age with absolutely no concept of this danger, wealthy patients were, quite literally, paying good money to have diseases surgically implanted directly into their own heads, all in pursuit of a slightly fuller-looking smile. And underneath the sheer medical failure of it all runs a darker, uglier current worth nomming directly. This was a transaction that flowed exclusively in one single direction. Healthy teeth always moved from the poor toward the rich, from the young and desperate toward the older and comfortable. Poverty itself was being actively harvested to decorate wealth. A child sold off a piece of their own head for a single coin because they genuinely needed that coin to survive, and a rich person bought it simply because they could afford to. And the entire grim exchange was widely considered a perfectly legitimate service, available to anyone willing to pay for it. It stands as one of the most nakedly literal illustrations of inequality that the entire history of dentistry has to offer. The practice eventually faded as its consistent failures became increasingly undeniable, and as manufactured replacement teeth steadily improved in quality. But for a time, within the fashionable salons and private surgeries of high society, the poor effectively functioned as a walking supply of spare biological parts for the rich, and a healthy young smile became something you could purchase outright, tooth by bloody tooth, from someone who simply couldn't afford to say no to the offer. Let's talk now about the true villain lurking behind this entire story, that sweet, fine white powder that quietly funded so much of dentistry's grim history for centuries. Sugar. As sugar gradually became available to the wealthy classes of Europe, their teeth began rotting at a genuinely spectacular rate, and nobody embodies this particular phenomenon better than Queen Elizabeth I of England. A foreign visitor to her royal court famously noted that her teeth had turned visibly black, a condition widely blamed squarely on her well-known fondness for sweets. And here comes the detail that will genuinely break your brain a little. Blackened teeth eventually became so strongly associated with visible wealth that some ordinary commoners actually began deliberately blackening their own perfectly healthy teeth, purely to appear wealthier than they actually were. People were literally faking tooth decay as a fashionable status symbol. Let that be the very last time you ever feel genuinely bad about having a single cavity. Sugar's steady arrival changed absolutely everything, and not remotely for the better. For most of prior human history, tooth decay had been driven primarily by grit, general neglect, and the slow mechanical wear of coarse, unrefined food. But sugar represented an entirely different kind of enemy altogether, a substance that actively fed the resident bacteria living in the mouth and dramatically accelerated the pace of decay far beyond anything that had come before it. And crucially, in these early centuries, sugar itself remained staggeringly expensive, an exotic imported luxury affordable only to the genuinely wealthy. So the very people who could afford to consume the most of it were, ironically, the same people most enthusiastically dissolving their own teeth in the process. Elizabeth stands as the great enduring emblem of this whole phenomenon, precisely because the surviving historical accounts are so vivid and specific. She adored sweets of all kinds, indulged in them constantly and openly, and her teeth paid the full accumulated price over time. By her later years, foreign visitors to her royal court recorded, with the particular fascination reserved specifically for royalty, that the great and immensely powerful Queen of England had teeth that had visibly gone black with advancing decay. There is something almost poetic buried in that image. The single most powerful woman in the entire land, at the very height of a celebrated golden age, smiling through a mouth thoroughly ruined by the single most fashionable luxury available in her particular era. And then the story takes its genuinely mind-bending turn. Because the wealthy so visibly displayed rotten, blackened teeth as a direct result of all their expensive sugar consumption, black teeth themselves gradually became a recognized marker of social status. To have visibly decayed teeth was to openly advertise that you could genuinely afford sugar, that you were wealthy enough to eat sweets so regularly that your entire mouth had begun falling apart as a direct consequence. And so, remarkably, some people who genuinely couldn't afford real sugar took to deliberately blackening their own perfectly healthy teeth, faking the outward appearance of wealth-induced decay purely to seem more prosperous than their actual circumstances allowed. Sit with that particular detail for just a moment, because it stands as one of the most perfectly absurd episodes in the entire history of human vanity. There were people voluntarily painting their own perfectly good, healthy teeth black, deliberately imitating a visible symptom of disease, purely because that specific disease had somehow become a genuine badge of upper-class status. They looked at a queen's visibly rotting mouth and thought, essentially, I want that for myself, or at minimum, I want to look convincingly like I can afford that. Health itself was being actively disguised as illness, because illness had somehow become genuinely aspirational. The entire natural order of what people generally want to look like had been completely flipped upside down by the simple economics surrounding one particular sweet ingredient. Of course, as sugar gradually became cheaper and more widely available to ordinary people across the following centuries, this whole strange dynamic collapsed entirely on its own. Once virtually everyone could afford to rot their own teeth with regular sugar consumption, rotten teeth naturally stopped functioning as any kind of meaningful social distinction and simply became what happened universally to almost everyone, a shared misery rather than an exclusive elite privilege. The blackened tooth status symbol quietly died out, replaced eventually by the more familiar modern understanding that decay is simply decay, and nobody genuinely wants it for its own sake. But for one strange historical window, the smile of the truly wealthy was, quite literally, a ruin, and that particular ruin was, for a time, genuinely fashionable. Ordinary people actively counterfeited that same ruin in a deliberate attempt to climb their own social ladder. So the next time a stray cavity happens to get you down, take a small dark measure of comfort in knowing that there was once an entire age in which your bad tooth would have marked you out, not as simply unlucky, but as fabulously, enviably rich. Now gently, let's discuss the smell. For most of recorded human history, bad breath wasn't merely an occasional embarrassment to be managed politely. It was, quite simply, the default baseline state for the entire species. With rotting teeth, chronically infected gums, and no reliable method of proper cleaning available, the average historical mouth amounted to a genuinely fragrant, ongoing catastrophe. People were fully aware of this problem and tried desperately to address it, chewing on parsley, cloves, and fresh mint, or rinsing thoroughly with wine and vinegar. Ancient medical texts across numerous cultures are absolutely full of breath-freshening recipes, which tells you a great deal about exactly how widespread and exactly how hopeless this particular problem genuinely was. Courtship, business negotiation, and even ordinary daily conversation all happened, by necessity, at a careful physical distance that history has politely declined to record in any real detail. To fully understand the genuine scale of the problem, you have to picture the average historical mouth as a small, warm, permanently inhabited ecosystem. Decaying teeth, pockets of festering infection tucked into the gums, food trapped indefinitely in gaps with absolutely no floss available to remove it, all of it quietly stewing together in the dark, moist warmth. This isn't remotely a recipe for the occasional bad day. This is a recipe for a constant, powerful odor that followed a person everywhere they went throughout their life, as permanent a feature as the color of their own eyes. And because nearly everyone shared the exact same condition, nearly everyone lived comfortably inside this shared haze, blissfully nose-blind to a reality everyone silently experienced together. The remedies people reached for were fragrant, entirely sensible in their intent, and almost completely useless against the actual underlying problem. Chewing sprigs of fresh parsley or mint, or handfuls of various aromatic herbs, could throw a temporary, pleasant scent directly over top of the underlying disaster, the historical equivalent of spraying air freshener liberally around a room where something has, in fact, died. Cloves proved especially popular, valued both for their genuinely strong scent and because they happened to carry a mild numbing quality that dulled tooth pain simultaneously. For a few brief minutes after chewing, the breath genuinely improved. The underlying rot, of course, remained exactly where it had always been. Rinses represented the other great historical hope, and here people across many different cultures got genuinely inventive over the centuries. Wine, vinegar, various herbal infusions, all manner of swished liquids were pressed into active service, intended to sweeten the breath and cleanse the mouth. Some carried genuine mild antibacterial properties and likely did a small amount of real good, but none of them ever addressed the actual underlying source of the problem. The decaying teeth and infected gums kept quietly producing the underlying smell faster than any available rinse could hope to wash it away. You could freshen the exit as thoroughly as you liked. The factory producing the problem simply kept on running regardless. The written historical record makes this widespread desperation genuinely clear. Reach back into the medical and household texts of almost any literate ancient culture you care to examine, and you will consistently find breath remedies, recipe after recipe for pastes, rinses, and things to chew, all promising faithfully to sweeten the mouth. When any single problem manages to generate that many attempted solutions across that many different centuries and cultures, you are almost certainly looking at something both genuinely universal and genuinely unsolved. People cared enormously about this problem. They simply had no reliable way of ever actually winning against it. And this reality shaped how ordinary people related to one another in ways that are almost impossible to fully reconstruct today, precisely because nobody bothered writing down the awkward underlying truth of it at the time. How closely did people actually stand to one another during ordinary conversation? How did courtship even function, when leaning in close for a whispered word meant leaning directly into a wall of decay? These intimate, everyday realities went almost entirely unrecorded, precisely because they felt far too ordinary and far too indelicate to ever mention directly in writing. History carefully preserves the herbs and the recipes, while discreetly declining to describe, in any real detail, the actual smell they were desperately fighting against. So the next time you casually swish some mouthwash, chew a stick of gum, or absent-mindedly pop a mint before an important meeting, understand clearly that you are quietly enjoying a genuinely modern miracle. For thousands of years, humanity conducted the entirety of its love affairs, its business dealings, and its friendships inside a persistent fog of bad breath that no available herb could ever truly lift, standing, perhaps, just a little farther apart from one another than we typically do today, and never once openly admitting exactly why. It's time to talk about the gums, which had their own particular ways of betraying an unlucky person. One of the cruelest was scurvy, the disease of vitamin deficiency that plagued sailors on long ocean voyages. Deprived of any fresh fruit for months on end, a sailor's gums would swell up, darken, and begin bleeding freely, while their teeth loosened steadily and eventually simply fell out of their own softening jawbone. Old healed wounds would reopen entirely on their own. And men who had somehow survived violent storms and cannon fire were, in the end, quietly undone by nothing more than the lack of a single lime. Gum disease certainly wasn't limited purely to sailors, of course. On dry land, poor diets left countless millions of ordinary people with mouths that bled at the slightest touch, their teeth slowly loosening in the process. Scurvy stands as one of history's quiet mass killers, and it worked its particular horror slowly and methodically. The disease stems directly from a lack of vitamin C, which the human body requires in order to produce collagen, the very substance that holds soft tissue together throughout the body. Without it, the body genuinely begins coming apart at the seams, quite literally. And some of the earliest, most dramatic warning signs consistently appeared first in the mouth. The gums, rich in the very connective tissue that vitamin C actively maintains, were frequently among the very first casualties, swelling up spongy and purple, bleeding at the lightest touch, and steadily receding away from the teeth they were originally meant to anchor firmly in place. For a sailor several months into a long voyage, surviving on nothing but salted meat and hard biscuit, this represented a genuine waking nightmare that unfolded gradually in distinct stages. First came exhaustion and a deep, generalized aching. Then the gums began turning dark, soft, and bloody, until simply eating became a genuine act of agony, and the teeth themselves began wobbling loosely in their own sockets. Men reported their teeth simply falling out entirely as the tissue holding them in place dissolved away beneath them. And in one of the disease's most genuinely gothic touches, old healed wounds and long-set broken bones would actually reopen and come apart again, because the very collagen holding those old repairs together was breaking down simultaneously throughout the body. The body was, quite literally, undoing its own medical history in real time. There's a deep, bitter irony buried in exactly what these particular men were up against. They were tough, hardened sailors, survivors of violent tempests, brutal naval battles, and every conceivable danger the open sea could throw directly at them. Cannon fire hadn't managed to kill them. Drowning hadn't managed to kill them. And here they were instead, being methodically dismantled from the inside out by the simple absence of something as humble as a single piece of fresh fruit. The eventual cure, once it was finally properly understood, was almost insultingly simple: a regular ration of citrus fruit, a lime or a lemon, and the entire horror could be prevented completely. Whole ship crews died needlessly for want of it, long before anyone finally connected the obvious dots. But it would be a genuine mistake to think of bleeding, failing gums as purely a maritime curiosity limited to sailors alone. Back on dry land, among the general population, gum disease remained thoroughly rampant for closely related underlying reasons. Poor diets lacking in the fresh foods that keep a mouth genuinely healthy left millions of ordinary people with chronically inflamed, steadily bleeding gums, receding gradually and loosening teeth that might otherwise have lasted for decades longer. You didn't need to sail anywhere at all to lose your own teeth to failing gums. You simply needed to be poor and to eat badly, which accurately described the overwhelming majority of humanity across most of recorded history. The genuinely insidious thing about gum disease is exactly how painless it can remain during its early stages, how easy it is to ignore completely until it's already far too late to reverse. Teeth that seemed perfectly sound and healthy would gradually loosen, drift out of alignment, and finally give up entirely, not because of any single dramatic cavity, but simply because the supporting foundation beneath them had quietly eroded away over time. People lost entire mouths full of otherwise perfectly healthy teeth this exact way, undone not by decay itself, but by the slow, silent failure of the very tissue meant to hold everything securely in place. So spare a passing thought tonight for the sailors, dismantled slowly by nothing more than the lack of a single lime, and for the countless people back on land whose otherwise good teeth loosened and eventually fell out entirely for want of a decent, balanced diet. The gums served as the silent foundation of the entire mouth, and when that foundation finally failed, it inevitably took everything resting on top of it down along with it, one bloody, wobbling tooth at a time. When the pain finally became genuinely unbearable, and there was no barber nearby, no traveling fair in town, and simply no coin available to pay for anything, people turned instead to the only remaining tools they had left: magic and simple faith. Toothache cures scattered throughout history read almost like a cookbook written by someone in the grip of a fever dream. You might be advised to touch the tooth of a dead man directly, to carry a mole's severed foot in your pocket for good luck, to press a live, warm frog firmly against your aching cheek, or to whisper a specific set of words while a particular species of bird happened to fly directly overhead. None of it worked, obviously, not even slightly. But when you wake up at 3 in the morning with a jaw that's pulsing in agony and genuinely no other options available to you, you will try absolutely anything at all, including attempting to negotiate directly with amphibians. The sheer variety of these historical remedies is genuinely staggering, and it stretches across virtually every culture and every century you might care to examine closely. In one particular region, sufferers were advised to bite directly on the tooth of a corpse, effectively attempting to transfer their own pain onto the already dead, who presumably had considerably bigger problems to worry about. In another region entirely, people carried a small animal bone or a severed foot as a personal charm, its supposed power residing in nothing more substantial than the sheer hope the sufferer had personally invested in it. Some cures involved carefully writing mysterious protective words onto a scrap of parchment and wearing it pressed directly against the aching cheek, almost as though the offending tooth itself could somehow read the words and be quietly shamed into behaving properly. The frog remedy genuinely deserves special mention here because it appears repeatedly, in various different forms, across the historical record with remarkable persistence over time. The underlying idea was that pressing a live frog or toad firmly against the aching jaw would somehow draw the pain directly out of the sufferer's body and transfer it into the unfortunate animal instead. Exactly where this particular notion originated remains genuinely anyone's guess. But you can picture the desperate scene clearly enough regardless. A person, sleepless and half-mad with pain, holding a thoroughly confused and deeply unhappy amphibian pressed against the side of their own face in the darkness, silently willing the throbbing agony to please transfer itself into the waiting frog instead. The frog, needless to say, proved no genuine help whatsoever, and neither in the end did anything else people tried. What unites all of these varied historical cures is that they operated fundamentally on a principle of sympathy and transfer, rather than on any real understanding of the actual underlying problem itself. Pain was treated as though it were a distinct entity, a separate thing that could be moved, tricked, bargained with, or frightened away entirely, rather than correctly understood as simply a symptom of ongoing physical decay. Nobody was genuinely addressing the actual rotting tooth itself, because nobody involved possessed the means to do so. So the desperate mind reached instead for ritual, for the psychologically comforting structure of doing one very specific thing in one very specific way, in the fragile hope that the universe might, just this once, take some pity on the sufferer. And here is the part genuinely worth understanding rather than simply mocking from a comfortable distance. These particular remedies were not stupid, not really. They represent exactly what a person does when they have absolutely no power over their own ongoing suffering. A person in genuine agony, with no available medicine, no real relief in sight, and no clear explanation for what's happening to them, is simply not going to lie perfectly still and passively accept it. They are going to act, because acting of any kind feels considerably better than pure helplessness, even when the specific action in question happens to be pressing a live toad firmly against their own face. The charm itself never actually cured the underlying tooth, but it gave the suffering person something concrete to do during the long, dark hours of the night, a small, admittedly false, handle on a situation that otherwise offered absolutely none at all. There was also, occasionally, a genuine sliver of accidental benefit buried within these rituals. The soothing ritual of the cure itself, the calm, reassuring words of a wise local healer, the simple, basic act of being personally tended to and cared for by another human being. These things could genuinely ease a person's overall distress, even when they did absolutely nothing measurable for the tooth itself. Anxiety reliably amplifies physical pain, and genuine comfort reliably dampens it in turn. So a soothing ritual might well have made the darkest hours of the night feel a small fraction more bearable, not because any actual magic was at work, but simply because being cared for by another person is, in its own quiet way, a genuine medicine all its own. So the charms and the whispered prayers filled the enormous void where real, effective dentistry should rightfully have stood, for thousands of years, across millions of sleepless, aching mouths. They never actually worked, not once, not really. But they were genuinely all that people had available to them, and in the very darkest hours of a toothache with absolutely no end in clear sight, even a warm frog and a whispered prayer felt considerably better than facing that particular pain entirely alone. For the faithful sufferer in particular, there existed one specific figure to turn to for comfort: Saint Apollonia. According to surviving legend, she was an early Christian martyr whose persecutors violently knocked out or shattered every single one of her teeth, which understandably established her, over time, as the patron saint of toothache and of dentistry more broadly. For centuries afterward, people suffering in genuine agony would pray directly to Apollonia for relief, and her devotional image, frequently shown holding a single extracted tooth gripped in a small pair of pincers, hung quietly in homes and churches throughout entire regions. It was never a genuine cure in any medical sense, but it was, unmistakably, a form of real comfort. And when the only available alternative was a complete stranger wielding a metal key, a heartfelt prayer directed at a sympathetic saint must have felt like the considerably safer appointment to keep. The underlying story behind her patronage is, as these things tend to be, a genuinely grim one. Apollonia was said to have been an elderly woman living during a period of active religious persecution, seized by a hostile mob who, among various other torments inflicted upon her, struck her repeatedly in the face with such violence that they broke and knocked out every one of her teeth entirely. This one specific detail, her ruined, broken mouth, is precisely what fixed her permanently in popular religious imagination as the dedicated protector of anyone whose own teeth happened to be causing them genuine misery. She had suffered exactly what they personally feared, and considerably worse besides, and so she would surely understand their own suffering completely. That underlying sense of shared understanding was really the entire point of the devotion. There is a particular, genuine comfort in praying specifically to someone who has personally endured your exact same ordeal before you. A person clutching their own swollen jaw at midnight could appeal directly to Apollonia, not as some distant, abstract, unknowable power, but as a specific figure who had genuinely felt her own teeth broken and violently torn away. She understood. She truly knew. And in an age where a toothache represented a lonely private hell with absolutely no medical relief available anywhere, the simple feeling that a sympathetic presence was genuinely listening, one who had personally walked that exact same road before you, was worth a very great deal indeed. Her devotional image became genuinely widespread across the Christian world, and it's oddly touching once you fully understand the underlying context. Apollonia was frequently depicted holding a pair of pincers or tongs, gripping a single extracted tooth firmly between them. The very instrument of her own historical torment transformed permanently into her identifying religious symbol. These images appeared consistently in churches, in painted altarpieces, and in small personal devotional tokens that ordinary people kept close to themselves at all times. To keep her likeness somewhere in the home was, in effect, to keep a dedicated spiritual guardian nearby against future tooth pain, a kind of spiritual insurance policy against the next inevitable flare-up. People also regularly invoked her name directly in charms and whispered prayers spoken at the exact moment of acute pain, sometimes blending faith and folk remedy together into a single desperate, combined ritual. A whispered prayer to Apollonia might be spoken aloud while some herbal paste was simultaneously applied, or her name might be carefully written down and worn pressed against the cheek, in much the same manner as the other folk charms discussed earlier. Faith and folklore blended together quite freely in these moments, because the actual sufferer cared very little about any strict theological boundaries. They cared, understandably, about genuine relief from wherever it might happen to come. It's admittedly easy, from a comfortable modern vantage point, to smile slightly at the idea of praying to a saint specifically for relief from a toothache. But consider carefully the actual choice genuinely on the table at the time. On one side sat a heartfelt appeal to a compassionate religious figure, costing absolutely nothing, harming no one whatsoever, and offering at minimum the genuine comfort of feeling personally heard. On the other side sat the actual available medical options of the day, a barber-surgeon wielding unwashed tools, a traveling showman sporting a necklace made of teeth, or a locksmith's crowbar applied directly to your own living jaw with absolutely no pain relief whatsoever. Suddenly, the quiet prayer starts to look like the genuinely sensible, and certainly the far gentler first resort available. So for centuries on end, Saint Apollonia stood faithful watch over the aching mouths of the devoted, a martyr whose own broken teeth made her the perfect companion in shared suffering. She couldn't fill a cavity herself, or drain a swollen abscess, but she could remain present, in image and in name, a small genuine point of comfort during the long, dark night of an unrelenting toothache. And for a great many frightened, hurting people across the centuries, that quiet presence was the only real mercy genuinely available to them. For those brave enough, or desperate enough to seek out an active treatment, some of the available options bordered on outright medieval torture, because in truth, they essentially were exactly that. In an attempt to kill the nerve inside a badly rotten tooth, practitioners sometimes resorted to cauterizing it directly, which is simply a polite way of saying they burned it with a red-hot metal wire, or dripped strong acid directly onto the exposed, sensitive pulp. The underlying theory was straightforward enough. Destroy the nerve entirely, and it can no longer transmit any pain signals whatsoever. And in a genuinely horrible sort of way, it sometimes actually worked. The experience of arriving at that particular outcome, however, involved a level of suffering that makes even a difficult modern root canal look, by comparison, like a relaxing afternoon at the spa. You didn't so much receive treatment in the modern sense as you received a form of punishment. The underlying logic wasn't entirely wrong either, which is precisely the unsettling part of this whole story. The pain of a badly decayed tooth genuinely comes from the living nerve inside it, the sensitive pulp sitting at the very core of the tooth. Destroy that nerve entirely, and the pain does indeed stop. Modern dentistry, in a real sense, does exactly this same thing during a standard root canal procedure today, carefully removing the diseased pulp under heavy, effective anesthesia. The historical practitioners of the era had genuinely grasped the correct underlying principle. What they conspicuously lacked was absolutely everything else that makes the modern version of this procedure genuinely bearable. The numbing agents, the surgical precision, the sterile tools, and any reliable method of accomplishing it without inflicting fresh, immediate agony in the process. Cauterization using a heated metal wire was one favored method, and it is exactly as unpleasant as it sounds. The practitioner would heat a thin metal instrument until it glowed a dull red, and then apply it directly onto the exposed nerve sitting inside the decayed tooth. The intense heat would sear the living nerve to death, and once it was fully dead, it could no longer transmit any further pain signals at all. The obvious catch, of course, is that burning a living nerve with a red-hot wire is itself already one of the single most intense pains a human being can possibly experience, delivered at full force, with no relief whatsoever available in the agonizing seconds before the nerve finally died completely and fell silent. Acid represented the other common route to that exact same destination. Various strong corrosive substances were carefully dripped or packed directly into the cavity, with the explicit aim of chemically destroying the nerve outright, dissolving the underlying source of the pain entirely. This approach was, if anything, considerably less controllable than the heated wire method, because acid, unfortunately, does not stay neatly confined to wherever you happen to place it. It would eat readily into the surrounding gum tissue, just as easily as it attacked the intended nerve, spreading painful burns and lasting damage well beyond the originally intended target, causing open wounds that could fester dangerously long after the original toothache itself had already resolved. Both of these methods shared the exact same fundamental underlying bargain, and it was a genuinely devilish one. You could, indeed, successfully stop the pain of a rotten tooth this way, but only by first passing through a gate of even worse pain to actually get there, and only by inflicting real, lasting physical damage on your own mouth in the process. It amounted to trading one chronic, ongoing misery for a single acute horror, based purely on the promise of eventual relief waiting somewhere on the far side. For someone who had already been unable to properly sleep or eat for weeks on end, that particular trade could genuinely look worth making, which is precisely how these brutal treatments managed to persist for as long as they did, despite being, by any reasonable measure, thoroughly brutal, with no real guarantee whatsoever of a clean, successful outcome. A poorly executed cauterization might only partially kill the intended nerve, leaving behind pain that would simply flare back up again later. The resulting burns from either method could easily become infected themselves, introducing an entirely new and potentially deadly problem where, before the treatment, there had merely existed a single bad tooth. You might endure the searing agony of the actual treatment itself, and still end up considerably worse off afterward than you had been when you started, now nursing an actively infected chemical burn on top of your original troubles. So these fire and acid cures stand today as a stark, sobering reminder of exactly how desperate the pre-modern mouth could genuinely make a person feel. When the throbbing finally became truly unendurable, some people willingly submitted themselves to being deliberately burned or chemically dissolved from the inside, gambling extreme immediate pain against the fragile hope of lasting peace afterward. And sometimes, remarkably, it actually did work as intended. But you paid dearly for that eventual peace, in a currency made entirely of pure suffering, and the receipt for that payment was written directly into your own scar tissue. Slowly and quite mercifully, things finally began to change for the better. By the 1600s and 1700s, an entirely new kind of practitioner started appearing across Europe, one who focused exclusively on the mouth, and who actually attempted to genuinely understand it as a subject in its own right. They called themselves, somewhat grandly, operators for the teeth. And while many of them remained little more than skilled tooth pullers wearing a fancier title, some genuinely began keeping careful written notes, refining their surgical instruments, and treating dentistry as a serious, developing craft rather than merely a carnival sideshow act. It remained messy and thoroughly unregulated, and plenty of outright fraud continued roaming the seasonal fairs regardless. But the essential seed of an actual, legitimate profession had finally, genuinely been planted. For the very first time in recorded history, having your teeth properly examined was gradually becoming something other than a humiliating public performance. This particular shift was gradual and genuinely uneven, but it was real nonetheless. For most of prior human history, the mouth had remained something of an afterthought, handled casually on the side by barbers, or transformed into pure spectacle by traveling showmen, or left entirely to prayer and desperate folk charms. Now, a small but steadily growing number of people were actively choosing to specialize, making the teeth their entire professional focus and subject of serious study, rather than treating dental work as merely one grim item on a long, unrelated menu of other services offered. Specialization, as it turns out, is precisely how any professional field genuinely begins to improve over time, because a person who focuses on doing only one particular thing every single day, for years on end, eventually starts to genuinely master it in ways a generalist never could. These early operators for the teeth occupied a genuinely strange middle ground between the old brutal world and the emerging new one. Some of them remained, at their core, essentially glorified tooth pullers, offering the exact same brutal extractions their crude predecessors had always provided, simply now wrapped in a fancier professional title, and perhaps accompanied by a somewhat cleaner coat. But the genuinely better practitioners among them were actively trying to accomplish considerably more. They experimented seriously with properly cleaning teeth, with carefully fitting replacement teeth, with treating underlying problems before they inevitably progressed to requiring full extraction. They began tentatively thinking, for the first time, in terms of active preservation rather than simply routine removal, which represented a genuinely quiet revolution within a trade that had, up until then, mostly just been about yanking troublesome things out as quickly as possible. Crucially, some of these early practitioners actually started writing their observations down in a systematic way. This detail matters considerably more than it might initially seem to. As long as accumulated dental knowledge lived only inside the private hands and personal habits of individual practitioners, that knowledge inevitably died along with them, and every single new tooth puller was forced to start again entirely from scratch. But once people genuinely began recording what they personally observed, what specific techniques worked, what clearly failed, which particular tools performed noticeably better than others, that accumulated knowledge could finally begin to build steadily and pass reliably onward to the next generation. Careful notes, and eventually complete written books, meant that the next generation of practitioners could finally stand comfortably on the accumulated shoulders of the last, rather than endlessly reinventing that same painful wheel over and over again. The available tools themselves improved steadily alongside this new way of thinking. Practitioners who genuinely took their work seriously began carefully refining their surgical instruments, designing specialized forceps shaped precisely for particular individual teeth, developing improved scrapers specifically for cleaning purposes, gradually moving beyond the crude, one-size-fits-all crowbar approach embodied by the old dental key. A tool thoughtfully designed for one particular specific job invariably accomplishes that job with considerably less collateral destruction. And as the available tools grew steadily more specialized over time, the overall damage inflicted on the average patient slowly, mercifully, began to genuinely decrease as a direct result. None of this happened cleanly or all at once, and it would be genuinely misleading to paint too tidy a picture of straightforward progress marching steadily forward. The traveling fairs still had their showmen. The outright fraudsters still sold their colored water and their so-called miracle powders to the gullible and the genuinely desperate alike. For a considerable stretch of time, a suffering person might just as easily encounter a thoughtful, careful, note-taking craftsman as they might encounter a feathered charlatan wielding a tooth necklace, with no genuinely reliable way to tell the two apart in advance. The old brutal world and the emerging new one coexisted uneasily side by side, jostling for space within the exact same muddy marketplace. But the overall direction of travel had nonetheless been firmly set in motion. The very existence of people who now called themselves operators for the teeth, who specialized, who studied seriously, who wrote things down, who continuously refined their craft, marked the genuine beginning of dentistry becoming something considerably more than a mere sideline profession or a public spectacle. It represented the awkward, thoroughly unregulated, half-quackery adolescence of what would eventually become a genuinely respected profession. And out of that genuinely messy middle period, the modern dentist would eventually, gradually emerge. Every field of human endeavor eventually has its founding figure, and for the profession of dentistry, that man was Pierre Fauchard, a Frenchman working actively during the early 1700s. Fauchard is remembered today as the father of modern dentistry, and for genuinely good reason. He authored a groundbreaking book that carefully gathered together virtually everything then known about teeth into a single comprehensive volume, accurately described the true underlying causes of tooth decay, invented and steadily improved numerous dental instruments, and pioneered genuinely methodical approaches to fillings and dental prosthetics. He also firmly and publicly rejected the ancient toothworm superstition outright, which alone secured him a permanent place in medical history. Thanks largely to Fauchard's work, dentistry finally began its long, slow crawl away from the fairground stage and steadily toward something resembling a genuine operating room. Fauchard's great overarching achievement was taking an entire trade that had previously been scattered, secretive, and thoroughly riddled with superstition, and transforming it into an organized, coherent body of shareable knowledge. Before his work, whatever real dental skill existed tended to be jealously guarded by individual practitioners, passed along only in incomplete fragments, or simply lost entirely the moment a skilled practitioner happened to die. Fauchard did the exact opposite. He gathered together everything he personally knew, along with everything he could learn from others, and he published it all openly for anyone at all to read and study. In doing so, he single-handedly transformed dentistry from a loose collection of individual private tricks into a genuinely shared professional discipline that others could study carefully, build meaningfully upon, and continue to improve for generations afterward. His comprehensive book served as the true cornerstone of this entire transformation. It was thorough in a way that nothing published before it had ever managed to be, covering the detailed anatomy of the mouth, the actual underlying causes of dental disease, established methods of treatment, the careful construction of replacement teeth, and detailed technical descriptions of instruments and surgical techniques. It functioned, in effect, as the very first genuine textbook within the entire field, and it gave dentistry something it had genuinely never possessed before: a solid written foundation that a person could actually learn from directly, without needing to apprentice themselves personally to some secretive tooth puller and simply hope to pick up scraps of knowledge by careful observation alone. Fauchard also had the genuine good sense to firmly reject the persistent errors of the past, and chief among these was the toothworm myth itself. For 5,000 consecutive years, that imaginary little serpent had been steadily blamed for tooth decay. And here, finally, was a serious, respected practitioner declaring plainly and publicly that the whole idea was simply nonsense. He correctly understood that decay had genuine physical causes, closely connected to diet and to substances left sitting on the teeth over time. And while he certainly didn't possess the full modern understanding of bacteria, he was pointing firmly in precisely the right direction, decisively away from the magical thinking that had thoroughly dominated the field for millennia beforehand. Killing off the worm myth for good proved every bit as important to the field's progress as any physical tool he personally designed. And he genuinely did design a great many tools and techniques, along with real, substantive improvements to the actual practice of dental care. He refined existing surgical instruments, developed considerably better methods for filling decayed teeth, and did serious, methodical work on dental prosthetics, the careful replacement of lost teeth with properly constructed artificial ones. He experimented extensively with better ways to hold false teeth securely in place, and with methods to straighten crooked natural teeth, laying important early groundwork for entire fields of dentistry that would only fully blossom many centuries later. His overall approach was methodical, genuinely curious, and firmly grounded in careful observation rather than blind adherence to tradition, which was precisely the fundamental shift the entire field had been quietly waiting for. Perhaps most importantly of all, Fauchard treated dentistry itself as a genuinely dignified profession worthy of real respect and serious rigor, rather than dismissing it as a lowly sideline occupation or a carnival act performed for cheap entertainment. By writing seriously, working methodically, and sharing his knowledge openly with others, he effectively modeled exactly what a proper dentist could become. Not a showman, not a barber filling an idle spare hour, but a genuine specialist possessing real knowledge and real skill, applied thoughtfully to a legitimate ongoing medical need. He fundamentally raised the entire standard of what this kind of work could actually be for. The full road stretching from Fauchard all the way to the modern dental clinic remained genuinely long, and considerable additional suffering still lay ahead before true anesthesia and full modern understanding would finally arrive. But he firmly set the overall direction for everyone who followed. He gathered the scattered knowledge together. He killed off the persistent old myths. He steadily refined the underlying craft, and he dignified the entire profession, all within a single, genuinely remarkable career. If dentistry has one single moment where it decisively stopped being purely a fairground horror and genuinely started becoming a real science instead, that particular moment unquestionably belongs to Pierre Fauchard, and every quiet, competent modern dental appointment today owes him a small, silent debt of gratitude. Vanity, as it turns out, is certainly not a purely modern invention, and neither is humanity's apparent willingness to actively damage itself in relentless pursuit of it. For centuries on end, people chasing after a genuinely bright smile scrubbed their teeth using all manner of harsh, abrasive substances. And early dentists of the era frequently made the underlying problem considerably worse by treating stained teeth directly with strong corrosive acids that did, admittedly, succeed in stripping away visible surface stains. The real problem was that the same acid also stripped away the protective enamel underneath, leaving teeth looking noticeably whiter in the immediate moment, and then leaving them permanently defenseless against future decay for the rest of their remaining lifespan. People were, quite literally, dissolving their own teeth in order to make them shine a little brighter. It stands as history's rough equivalent of deliberately setting your own house slightly on fire, purely to get rid of one troublesome spider. The underlying desire itself is genuinely ancient and thoroughly understandable on a basic human level. A bright, visibly clean smile has always signaled health, youth, and attractiveness, and people have consistently wanted exactly that throughout recorded history. The genuine tragedy lies not in the wanting itself, but specifically in the methods used to chase it, which ranged all the way from merely abrasive to outright destructive. In active pursuit of visible whiteness, people regularly scrubbed their teeth with harsh powders made from ground shells, powdered brick dust, and various other coarse grit, steadily grinding away not just the surface stains, but the very structural surface of the tooth itself, one vigorous scrubbing session at a time. Then came the acid treatments, which proved considerably worse precisely because they appeared, at first glance, to work so remarkably well. When early dental practitioners applied strong acids directly onto stained teeth, the resulting effects were immediate and genuinely dramatic. The acid ate steadily away at the discolored surface layer, and the teeth emerged looking visibly, satisfyingly whiter almost instantly. To the delighted patient examining the results in a mirror, this felt like a genuine triumph, an instant and impressive improvement. The catch, entirely invisible in that hopeful moment, was that the acid hadn't simply removed the surface stain. It had removed the enamel itself along with it. Enamel serves as the hard, protective outer shell of the tooth, and it stands as the single most important defense any tooth naturally possesses. Critically, it does not regenerate or grow back once lost. Once it's gone, it's permanently gone, and the softer, considerably more vulnerable material sitting underneath is left fully exposed to every acid, every trace of sugar, and every bacterium the mouth has to offer. So the whitening acid, in the very act of stripping away enamel to reveal a whiter-looking tooth, was simultaneously tearing down the essential protective wall that had been keeping that same tooth safe from decay in the first place. The gleaming, whitened result lasted only a short while. The resulting vulnerability lasted for the entire remainder of that tooth's now considerably shortened lifespan. This represents the cruel underlying joke buried within the entire whitening practice. The treatment people sought out for the sake of achieving a healthier-looking smile ended up actively causing their teeth to rot away considerably faster than before. Stripped of their protective enamel, the newly whitened teeth decayed more readily than ever, discolored again fairly quickly as the newly exposed inner material darkened once more, and ultimately failed considerably sooner than they otherwise would have if simply left entirely alone. People were consistently trading away long-term dental health in exchange for a brief, short-term flash of visible brightness, and doing so enthusiastically, precisely because the immediate reward felt so satisfyingly visible, while the eventual cost remained so thoroughly hidden from view. You can see clearly, in this particular pattern, an underlying theme that runs consistently throughout so much of this dark overall history. The constant, repeated triumph of visible short-term benefit over invisible long-term harm. Just as people pack their aching cavities with poisonous lead in pursuit of immediate relief, and just as some people deliberately blacken their own teeth simply to appear wealthier, here we find people dissolving away their own natural protection purely for a brief moment of added shine. The human mouth, again and again throughout this story, became the site of bargains that felt genuinely good in the immediate moment and cost considerably more later on down the line. Not every culture throughout history actually wanted brilliantly white teeth, and this particular detail is where the overall history genuinely becomes fascinating. In Japan, for many centuries, a distinctive practice called ohaguro saw people, particularly married women and members of the social elite, deliberately dyeing their teeth a deep, glossy black. Far from being considered a sign of decay, jet black teeth were widely regarded as genuinely beautiful, sophisticated, and a clear mark of maturity and elevated social status. The dye itself even carried an accidental protective benefit for the teeth underneath. So while Europeans were busy poisoning themselves in pursuit of brighter whiteness, secretly envying the blackened teeth of their own wealthy elite, an entire separate culture had decided, quite reasonably in its own context, that genuine beauty exists firmly in the eye of the beholder, and in this particular case, the beholder happened to prefer black. The contrast between these two cultural approaches is almost perfectly symmetrical, and it serves as a wonderful reminder that so much of what any given culture assumes to be universal truth is really just local habit, dressed up convincingly as objective fact. In one part of the world, people were actively scrubbing and dissolving their own teeth in relentless pursuit of pure whiteness. In another part of the world entirely, people were deliberately, carefully, and quite proudly turning their teeth as glossy black as humanly possible. Both groups considered their own particular standard to be self-evidently beautiful. Both groups would likely have been thoroughly baffled by the other's contrary preference. Beauty, as it turns out, has never actually had one single fixed color. Ohaguro was never some haphazard, improvised folk practice. It stood instead as a refined and genuinely deliberate cultural custom, with deep historical roots. The dye itself was produced through a careful process involving iron filings dissolved in liquid, frequently combined with additional ingredients specifically intended to deepen and properly fix the resulting color, ultimately producing a rich, genuinely lustrous black finish. Properly applying and then carefully maintaining this dye required real, sustained effort along with regular reapplication, which itself carried its own social significance. To display perfectly, Glossily blackened teeth was to visibly demonstrate that you possess the time, the resources, and the cultural refinement necessary to maintain them properly. It functioned, in its own way, as a beauty routine every bit as demanding as any other practiced elsewhere in the world. The specific cultural meanings attached to this practice were genuinely rich and quite specific. Black teeth became particularly associated with married women, serving as a clearly visible signal of marital status and mature adult womanhood, much as other distinct cultures have historically used specific rings or particular garments for similar purposes. Among the aristocratic elite specifically, Ohaguro also carried strong connotations of sophistication and elevated social standing. Far from suggesting neglect or underlying disease, gleaming black teeth in this context communicated precisely the opposite impression entirely: genuine care, elevated status, mature adulthood, and clear belonging to a particular refined social world. Where a Western observer might see obvious decay, this particular culture saw genuine dignity instead. And here comes the specific detail that makes this whole story even more satisfying. The dye itself was never purely cosmetic in its effects. The iron-based compounds used throughout the Ohaguro process appear to have had a genuinely protective effect on the underlying teeth, helping to seal them effectively and guard against the very decay that the resulting black color superficially seemed to resemble from the outside. So this particular practice, which to an untrained outside eye might have looked like a strange embrace of visibly rotten teeth, was, in actual fact, quietly helping to preserve those same teeth over time. The black-toothed elite of historical Japan may well have genuinely possessed healthier mouths, on average, than the white-toothed, enamel-dissolving elite of contemporary Europe. The joke, in the end, turns out to be entirely on the whiteness worshippers after all. This detail flips the entire underlying premise of Western dental vanity completely on its head, in the most genuinely satisfying way possible. Europeans actively destroyed their own teeth chasing after whiteness, and some even faked visible decay purely to appear wealthier than they actually were. Meanwhile, here stood an entire culture that embraced black as their standard, found it genuinely beautiful, tied it closely to social status and mature adulthood, and accidentally protected their own teeth in the process as a happy side effect. It represents a near-total inversion of the usual story, and it should genuinely give anyone pause before assuming their own particular idea of a beautiful smile represents anything more universal than simply the fashion they personally happen to be born into. So the overall story of dental beauty across human history isn't really a single unified tale of humanity steadily striving toward one universal standard of whiteness. It is, instead, a story of wildly different peoples deciding, independently, that wildly different things were genuinely lovely, and pursuing those differing ideals with entirely equal conviction. Somewhere in Europe, a person was busy dissolving away their own enamel in pursuit of a slightly brighter gleam, while simultaneously, halfway across the world, someone else was lovingly blackening their own teeth to a glossy shine, and quietly pitying anyone pale enough to still be showing white. Beauty made up its own rules in its own particular places, and it never once fully agreed with itself across cultures. Let's pause now for something almost gentle by comparison. What did people historically do with the baby teeth that children naturally lost? Across the world, the answer comes wrapped consistently in folklore. In many different places, a small mouse or rat was said to collect the lost tooth, chosen specifically because rodents possess notably strong teeth that never actually stop growing throughout their entire lives, precisely the quality any parent would wish upon their own child. In parts of Europe, this evolved gradually into the image of a small mouse, and eventually, within the English-speaking world specifically, into a winged fairy who leaves behind a small coin in exchange. It's a genuinely sweet tradition, though once you remember the actual state of most adult teeth throughout history, The idea of a magical creature specifically obsessed with collecting them does take on a slightly darker undertone. The underlying logic behind the mouse is genuinely lovely once you properly understand it. A rodent's teeth are famously strong, and crucially, they never stop growing throughout the animal's entire life. To a parent watching their own child lose the soft little baby teeth that would soon be replaced by permanent ones, the underlying wish was obvious enough. Let the new adult teeth come in just as strong and just as lasting as the mouse's own teeth. So a small ritual naturally grew up around this idea, in which the lost baby tooth was symbolically offered to a mouse, in the sincere hope that the creature would grant the child teeth every bit as durable as its own. It functioned, essentially, as a folk prayer for healthy adult teeth, cleverly disguised as a charming bedtime story for children. Versions of this same basic idea appear across an astonishing range of different cultures worldwide. In many Spanish-speaking countries, there exists a specific, well-known tooth-collecting mouse character, complete with his own name and distinct personality, beloved by children right up to the present day. Across France and various other parts of Europe, similar small creatures historically played this exact same role. The specific details naturally varied from place to place. The particular animal involved differed. The exact ritual shifted gradually from region to region, but the underlying core idea recurred again and again regardless. The lost tooth is symbolically given away to a small, strong-toothed creature in direct exchange for the hope of a healthy replacement. When an idea springs up independently in so many unconnected places around the world, it genuinely speaks to a shared, deeply human hope underlying it all. The winged fairy, familiar today throughout the English-speaking world, represents a relatively recent and somewhat gentler evolution of these considerably older traditions. The rodent, practical and admittedly a bit grubby by comparison, gradually softened over time into a delicate, magical figure who quietly slips into a child's room while they sleep, takes the lost tooth from beneath the pillow, and leaves a small coin behind in its place. The underlying transaction remains exactly the same, tooth traded for token, but the surrounding imagery grew considerably prettier, more overtly magical, and generally better suited to a modern nursery than to an old folk custom rooted originally in simple rodent envy. The mouse, in effect, went off to finishing school and came back transformed, complete with a fresh set of wings. There is something genuinely, quietly poignant buried in all of this, especially when you set it directly against everything else covered throughout tonight's story. Here, amid an overall history filled with screaming extractions, poisonous fillings, slowly rotting ivory, and battlefield-sourced dentures, sits one tender little ritual built entirely around the simple hope that a child's own teeth might somehow turn out well in the end. Parents who had themselves, quite likely, suffered through miserable dental problems of their own, who knew all too well exactly what likely lay ahead for their children, poured that hard-won knowledge instead into a hopeful, gentle bedtime charm. Please let this particular child's teeth turn out strong. Please let them be spared what I myself have had to endure. It represents love, quietly expressed through simple folklore. And of course, once you know the full grim history underlying it, the whole image does acquire that slightly darker charm the introduction promised. A magical being who steals quietly into homes at night, harboring a singular, oddly obsessive interest in collecting human teeth, is, if you think about it for too long, faintly unsettling, especially within a world where teeth were so routinely lost to rot, violence, and slow decay throughout history. The tooth fairy is genuinely sweet on the surface, and just a little bit macabre lurking underneath, which honestly makes her the perfect mascot for this entire subject we've been exploring tonight. So the quiet business of baby teeth stands apart as the one warm, genuinely hopeful corner within this otherwise cold overall history. It represents the specific part of the story where humanity, facing what felt like a near-certain future of dental misery, chose instead to tell its own children a kind and magical little story. A mouse, a fairy, a coin tucked beneath a pillow, and a quiet, universal wish that these small new teeth might, against all the accumulated odds of history, somehow manage to last. Now, at long last, we arrive at the moment this entire night's story has been quietly building toward. In the 1840s, everything changed at once, sparked by a single, world-altering idea. What if the patient simply didn't have to feel any of it at all? A dentist named Horace Wells began experimenting seriously with laughing gas, and soon afterward, ether was successfully used to render a patient fully unconscious during surgery. For the very first time across the entire recorded history of the human species, you could have a rotten tooth pulled and feel absolutely nothing whatsoever in the process. It is genuinely difficult to overstate just how enormous this single discovery truly was. Thousands upon thousands of years of screaming, of hired drummers brought in specifically to cover the noise, of desperately gripping the arms of a chair. All of it finally ended with the simple discovery that pain itself during treatment was now genuinely optional. Try for a moment to fully grasp the sheer accumulated weight of everything that came before this single moment, because that weight is precisely what gives the discovery its true meaning. Every single extraction, every filling, every cauterization, every desperate pull described throughout this entire episode tonight had been performed on a fully conscious, fully feeling human being. For thousands of years, across countless millions of individual people, every one of them remained wide awake throughout their own dental agony because there simply existed no viable alternative whatsoever. Pain during treatment wasn't merely a risk or an occasional unfortunate complication. It was an absolute guarantee, a permanent, unavoidable fixture of the entire human condition. And then, quite suddenly, it genuinely was not. The earliest experiments in this new field were tentative, and admittedly not without their own awkward public stumbles, as is generally true of any genuinely new discovery. Horace Wells, the dentist who first championed laughing gas specifically for dental procedures, believed passionately in its power to fully abolish pain, and he was, in fact, entirely correct, even though his own early public demonstrations didn't always proceed smoothly in front of skeptical audiences. The core underlying idea was nevertheless genuinely sound, and it would not remain denied for long. Around this same general period, ether was successfully used to put a patient fully to sleep during a separate surgical procedure, proving conclusively, beyond any real argument, that a person could indeed be rendered fully insensible and operated upon without suffering through a single moment of conscious pain. Try to imagine being among the very first patients to genuinely experience this. You have lived your entire life fully knowing that a bad tooth meant completely unavoidable agony, quietly bracing yourself for the coming horror exactly as countless generations before you had done. And instead, this time, you simply breathe something in. The world around you goes soft and distant, or perhaps fades away entirely. And when you eventually return to full awareness, the entire procedure is already over. The troublesome tooth is out, and you genuinely felt nothing at all throughout the process. For a person raised entirely on the absolute certainty of dental suffering, this must have felt like nothing short of genuine sorcery, a real, tangible miracle unfolding quietly inside an ordinary dentist's chair. This fundamental change rippled steadily outward, transforming absolutely everything it touched along the way. With the patient no longer thrashing about or screaming in agony, the practitioner could finally work slowly, carefully, and with genuine precision, taking the necessary time to do the job properly, rather than racing desperately to end the patient's torment as quickly as physically possible. Better available anesthesia made possible, for the first time, genuinely better dentistry overall, because a calm, still, entirely painless patient could finally be treated with a level of careful attention that had simply been impossible before, back when every single second represented its own fresh emergency of pure agony. The complete abolition of pain didn't merely spare people needless suffering. It fundamentally raised the entire achievable standard of what dental care could actually accomplish, and it finally drained away, at long last, the grim public theater that had surrounded dental care for so many centuries beforehand. There was no longer any real need for hired drummers and trumpeters to mask the sound of screaming, because there were, quite simply, no more screams left to mask. No more curious crowds gathered specifically to watch a fellow human being endure the genuinely unendurable, because there was, at long last, nothing left remaining to endure. The old fairground spectacle, that entire public performance built around visible pain, lost its entire reason for existing the very moment that pain itself could finally be switched off entirely. Dentistry could, at long last, move indoors permanently into quiet private rooms and become the calm, private, professional experience we recognize and rely on today. This discovery stands today as one of the truly great mercies within the entire history of medicine. This simple, genuinely staggering idea that a patient need not actually feel any of it. Everything covered throughout tonight's entire episode, all the imaginary worms, the crude locksmith's keys, the battlefield-sourced teeth, the burning wires pressed against living nerves, every single bit of it was written directly in pain, because pain was simply the water everyone alive at the time swam in constantly. And then, quite suddenly, sometime in the 1840s, someone finally reached over and turned it off completely. If you take away just one single comfort from tonight's story, let it be this simple fact. You happen to be born safely on the fortunate side of that discovery, and you will personally never have to know the considerably darker world that came steadily before it. We end tonight's journey where so many people, quite literally, once did. Because for all the strange comedy woven throughout this particular story, there remains a genuinely sober truth sitting quietly underneath all of it. Before the discovery of antibiotics, a simple, entirely untreated tooth infection could easily spread into the surrounding jawbone, into the bloodstream, and eventually into the brain itself, and it could genuinely kill you outright. In old surviving mortality records from cities like London, teeth were formally listed as an official recognized cause of death, and sometimes ranked surprisingly high on those lists. People generally didn't die from this dramatically or suddenly. They died quietly, from a molar they had chosen to ignore, from a swelling they had sincerely hoped would eventually pass on its own, from an infection that simply had nowhere modern and effective to be safely sent. That throbbing tooth you woke up with at the very beginning of tonight's story was never merely a minor inconvenience to be casually dismissed. For most of recorded human history, it represented a genuine, credible threat to your continued life. The full path leading from an ordinary toothache all the way to an early grave was considerably quieter and more mundane than you might initially expect, which is exactly what makes it so genuinely sobering to consider. It typically began with something everyone listening to this episode has, by this point, come to know well: a decayed tooth, an exposed, sensitive nerve, a persistent, nagging ache. Left entirely untreated, as it so frequently was throughout history, the underlying decay eventually reached the tooth's root, and a proper abscess formed there. A concentrated pocket of infection at the very base of the tooth, and an abscess, given absolutely no way out and no available medicine to actively fight it, simply does not remain contained indefinitely. It actively looks for somewhere else to go instead. From that initially small pocket of infection, serious trouble could spread in genuinely alarming directions. It might move directly into the surrounding jawbone itself, or into the soft tissues of the face and neck, causing dangerous swelling in the process. In the very worst cases, the infection reached all the way into the bloodstream and spread systemically throughout the entire body, or crept steadily toward the brain itself. Either outcome frequently proving fatal in an age with absolutely no reliable way to fight bodily infection at all. The humble bad tooth became, quite literally, the doorway to a systemic, potentially lethal illness, all originating from something most people would have initially dismissed as nothing more than a minor passing complaint. The old surviving mortality records make the true scale of this danger genuinely plain, in their own understated, bureaucratic way. Within the official mortality records kept faithfully in cities like London across earlier centuries, teeth appear again and again as a formally listed cause of death, not treated as some rare medical curiosity, but recorded instead as a regular, recurring category, sometimes accounting for a genuinely startling proportion of overall recorded deaths in a given period. People, quite simply, died directly from their teeth in numbers large enough to be carefully tallied and recorded alongside every other reliable, recognized killer of that particular age. It was, in the coldest possible bureaucratic terms, simply a perfectly normal way to die at the time. What genuinely lingers in the end is the sheer, quiet ordinariness of these particular deaths, the complete lack of drama surrounding them. There was no great dramatic battle involved, no sudden catastrophic event to point to. There was simply a person who had developed a sore tooth, who sincerely hoped it would eventually settle down on its own, who quietly endured the gradual swelling exactly as everyone around them endured such ordinary things, who perhaps eventually tried a folk charm, or a whispered prayer, or a fair day extraction performed by a stranger, and who then, quietly, steadily declined, and eventually died, undone entirely by an infection that today would be resolved completely, with nothing more than a short course of ordinary pills. The gap separating their unfortunate fate from our own comfortable safety today is measured out in nothing more than a small handful of chemical discoveries that they simply had the sheer misfortune to be born too early to benefit from. And that particular thread is precisely what ties this entire long, strange, and often unexpectedly funny history together into something genuinely worth pausing over tonight. Every single worm smoked out with burning henbane, every tooth pulled hastily at a crowded fair, every socket packed carelessly with molten lead, every desperate whispered prayer directed at Saint Apollonia. Each of these represented, in its own particular way, a small individual skirmish fought within one much larger, ongoing war against exactly this dreaded outcome. People were never merely being vain or simply squeamish about their own teeth. On some genuine level, they understood, or eventually came to learn through hard experience, that a mouth left entirely to rot could ultimately kill them outright. And everything they ever tried, however genuinely useless or brutal it may seem to us now, represented a real, sincere attempt to hold that quiet, patient killer at bay for just a little while longer. So we return, at last, to that same aching tooth you woke up with at the very beginning of tonight's journey, and we can finally see it now for exactly what it truly always was. Not a small, forgettable annoyance. Not a minor comic footnote to an otherwise ordinary day. For most of the entire span of human history, that steady throbbing in your jaw represented the genuine opening move of something that could, quite easily, have ended you completely. Faced without any real relief, without proper understanding, and without any genuinely reliable way to win against it, you now live safely on the far side of that long historical darkness, never more than a single appointment away from complete safety. Rest well tonight in that quiet knowledge. And so, at last, we reach the end of our long night spent wandering through the mouth of history. What a genuine journey it has been. You woke tonight with a single throbbing tooth and absolutely no relief in immediate sight. And from there, you wandered together through 5,000 years of imaginary worms, gritty Egyptian bread, and carefully gargled Roman urine. You met the barber-surgeon with his grim, bloody pole, the traveling showman with his necklace strung from teeth, and the locksmith's crude crowbar dressed up unconvincingly as a legitimate medical instrument. You endured, alongside history's ordinary people, extractions performed without any numbing whatsoever, fillings made from lead and simple wax, and dentures pulled directly from the fallen soldiers at Waterloo. You sat quietly in that chair, gripped the armrests tightly, and somehow together you made it all the way through to the end. Take just one final moment now to think of all the real people who genuinely did endure all of this. The Egyptian farmer with his teeth steadily ground down by gritty bread. The sailor whose gums slowly bled away for the simple want of a single lime. The frightened soul standing on that fairground stage, held firmly down while the drummers worked hard to drown out the sound of his own suffering. They had no anesthesia available to them, no antibiotics waiting in reserve, no quiet, clean private room to retreat safely into. They had only their charms, their whispered prayers each other, and a stubborn, quiet refusal to simply lie down and give up entirely. They faced pain that we tonight are fortunate enough to never truly have to know ourselves, and they carried on regardless, one aching day at a time. So tonight, as you settle in comfortably beneath your own warm blankets, safe and genuinely cared for, never more than a single phone call away from real, painless relief, spare one small, drowsy thought for all of them. Whisper a quiet, genuine thank you to the countless ancestors who survived the imaginary worms, the brutal dental keys, and the burning wires, so that you personally would never, ever have to. Because history, as we've seen tonight, may indeed be gross and painful, and occasionally involve someone pressing a confused frog against their own cheek at 3 in the morning. But it also stands as genuine proof of exactly how much the human spirit can endure and quietly overcome. And now at last you can finally rest. Good night.